Our next speaker is Dr. Anna Karakan from the Ween Bee Foundation, and she's going to be talking to us about the program Powerful Pollinators, a program that's designed to increase the prevalence, health and diversity of pollinators in our landscapes through the use of strategic planting of trees. And Powerful Pollinators is about planting guides that can help you do this in your area.
Pollinators. 90% of flowering plants worldwide depend upon them, and they support the production of 87 of the world's leading food crops. Pollinators are essential to life on Earth. Because they perform an essential ecosystem service, pollination, they underpin healthy diets, they drive biodiversity, and they're essential for healthy ecosystems. Without pollinators, we wouldn't have many of our fruit and vegetables like almonds, avocados, apples, even vegetables like carrots and onions. This presentation is about what each of us can do to help pollinators in their local landscape. Whether you're a large-scale commercial farmer or have a small back garden or terrace, each of us can take simple steps to support pollinators in our environment and help bring back the buzz. To get us started, here is Dr. Anna Karakan. Anna is a botanist and a beekeeper from the Western District of Victoria, and Anna is also a Ween Bee Foundation ambassador.
Welcome everyone to today's presentation here about powerful pollinators. On behalf of the Ween Bee Foundation, I'm excited to share with you, and also on behalf of our project partners, the Powerful Pollinators Project, bringing back the buzz with the Powerful Pollinators Guide. So what is the Powerful Pollinators Guide? Well, it's a powerful resource for you to bring back the buzz. That is, in encouraging and sustaining insect pollinator populations on farms, across agricultural landscapes, and in your backyard and garden. It's about giving you the knowledge and the capacity for creating havens for pollinators in small spaces and across large landscapes. It's about connecting you with your patch or your paddock, your local insect life, and bringing back the buzz by choosing local plants that will support insect pollinators in your area. And in today's presentation, we will be introducing to you the why, the what, and the how, and explaining and sharing key points. Specifically, the importance of pollinators. Why are they so vital? Supporting pollinators. What can we do to encourage and protect insect pollinators? And using the Powerful Pollinators Guide. So how do you go about creating an oasis for pollinators, whether it's on your farm or in your garden? Pollinators literally are the littlest things that run the world. So in the first section of today's presentation, the importance of pollinators, they are the canaries in the coal mine, whether it's in our productive or agricultural environments or our native ecosystems. Honeybees, native bees, and many other insect species provide a wealth of services to enable food production and to support and perpetuate native vegetation communities and habitats in our natural environments. Clearly, pollinators are important. 1 in every 3 bites of food you eat requires a pollinator to bring it to you. And the interconnectedness of insects across our native and productive landscapes is incredibly important. So we'll be sharing with you how to enhance these landscapes and environments to promote insect pollinators. In the context of Australian agriculture, bees, native bees and honeybees are incredibly important. They make a massive contribution to our food and fibre businesses. The value of pollinators can be seen in terms of quantity of production, and it's really apparent in the benefit that they give to food crops and agricultural systems. In this slide, I will be showing you that there are many foods that are highly or totally dependent upon pollinators, such as honeybees, to yield a crop, and those that are somewhat less dependent on pollinators but benefit from their contribution in terms of increased yields. So in the table on the left, you can see that there are many crops that are totally bee dependent, such as almonds and apples, avocados, blueberries, to name a few. There are also crops that are grown for seed production, and examples of that include carrot, celery, and even mustard and onion seeds. Broadacre crops that you may not think of as fruit necessarily, but still develop from a flower, are crops such as canola, which is enhanced by pollinator interaction, and that is grown to produce seed in order to make oil. The massive contribution and economic value of honeybees to Australian agriculture is at least $14.2 billion annually. And that's matched by other insect pollinators and native bees. And if you contrast that to the value of honey and hive products, it's orders of magnitude greater. So you can see that in terms of requiring a pollinator to bring you food, it really is food for thought. The value of pollinators is also very, very clearly indicated in terms of the quality of produce. And it's here where we talk about the degree of pollination that may occur in a flower with or without the contribution of visitation by a pollinator. And it's incomplete pollination versus complete, because it's all about the process of pollination in a flower. So pollination is how flowers are fertilized and become fruits, the seeds contained in them to grow into the next generation of plants. Optimal pollen deposition gives rise to the best fertilization rates of a flower's ovules or female parts by the pollen grains, which are the male gametes. And this in turn increases seed set and seed quality, and also fruit tissue quantity and quality, because in fruit producing plants, seeds that are produced in the fruit give off hormones that stimulate fruit tissue development. So adequate pollination is needed to set seed and produce high quality marketable fruit. That then commands a higher price at market and also a greater appreciation by the consumer of the perceived appeal and edibility of that fruit. And you can see in this slide that there are a number of images that indicate that concept really clearly. On the left, we have a tomato fruit, and the image above shows a completely pollinated tomato fruit with fully developed seeds, lots of pulp, and nice, thick, fleshy interior, compared to the somewhat withered and less filled interior of that fruit, of the incompletely pollinated tomato at the bottom. Similarly, in watermelons, which is the images in the center of the screen, the top image shows a completely pollinated watermelon fruit with lots of pips inside and very rich, luscious looking flesh and very visually appealing. Contrast that to the watermelon below, which has a rather insipid looking pale pink flesh that is far less visually attractive and just a lot less appealing as an edible item. Cucumbers are another fruit which develops from a flower that requires pollination, and you can also see in these two images on the right the differences in the quality of the fruit from an incompletely pollinated cucumber to a completely pollinated cucumber flower. There's all sorts of differences in terms of shape, texture, colour of fruits that are fully or incompletely pollinated. And sometimes if flowers are not completely pollinated, it can be due to factors such as too few insects in the environment, or stressors or negative effects such as application of chemicals at inappropriate times that may harm the pollinators. So why bring back the buzz? Well, in a nutshell, pardon the pun, more pollinators mean more pollination services for crops and native flora. And so by understanding the needs of pollinators, our invisible hardworking workforce, and providing for these needs, insect populations will increase in your environment and be ready to help pollinate your crops and gardens for free.
Thanks, Anna. And now let's hear from Dr. Megan Halcroft. Megan is a science communicator, a farmer, and a native bee specialist from New South Wales. And she's also a Ween Bee Foundation ambassador.
So we need to encourage the bees to come to our gardens and our crops by providing them with flowers. and native bees require native flowers in a lot of cases. So our native bees drive biodiversity because they've evolved with our native flowering plants over millions of years. So over the last 120 million years, Australian flora and native bees have co-evolved. And our iconic eucalypts and other plants in the Myrtaceae family have been evolving together, and they've seen the evolution of bee species that are the most diverse species in the world because of these bowls of nectar that our Myrtaceae flowers contain. Unlike social honeybees and stingless bees, our solitary bees don't need to collect food for a large community. They don't have to pack their shopping bags full of pollen and take it back to the nest. They just need to collect enough pollen to feed one individual bee at a time. So instead of packing pollen into their pollen baskets, they actually pack the pollen into what are called scopal hairs. And you'll see that underneath the body of this bee, she's carrying lots and lots of dry, fluffy pollen. This pollen is easily moved from the scopa to parts of the flower. You'll see this bee, she's foraging on a pea flower, and as she's collecting the nectar, the pollen that is on the anthers underneath her abdomen here are touching on the scopal hairs, and she's able to transfer the pollen that already was on that on those scopal hairs from the previous flower to the next flower as she forages. This enables cross-pollination from flower to flower and from same plant species, but within the same area. So we have over 2,000 species of native bee in Australia, and a lot of those, not all, but many of them have co-evolved with many of our native flowering plants. These bees are the best pollinators for these species of plant. Because of this, bees drive biodiversity. This bee here is a Lipotrichis, and she is buzz pollinating this Dianella flower. And our ground nesting bees are able to vibrate the anthers, which contain pollen inside little pores, and they have to shake the anthers so vigorously in order to liberate the pollen. And then the bee carries that pollen on her body from flower to flower. This enhances cross-pollination as well. So how do we support our native bees? We need to feed them, and we need to give them a place to nest and reproduce. And we need to practice bee-friendly methods of gardening or crop management. We need to have flowers for nectar, and nectar provides energy. So nectar contains sugars, but it also contains minerals and vitamins, which is very important for the development of the baby bees as they're in the nest. The pollen is the protein source. So our native bees are vegetarian. They have evolved over millennia from wasps that are meat eaters to vegetarian bees, and that's what makes a bee a bee. Bees feed their offspring pollen. And we need to provide seasonal abundance. So we need to plant flowers, flowering plants that will provide food resources for our bees and other insect pollinators throughout the year. Bees and pollinators need nectar for energy and pollen for protein. But not only do the flowers provide food for the bees provide a function of pollination for the flowers. So as the bee collects nectar as a food reward, it enhances the transfer of pollen from flower to flower. Honeybees collect pollen and nectar. They will take the pollen and nectar back to their hive, and as a community, they will value add those resources. The pollen is packed away and it has a small amount of nectar which has been added to it to help pack it into its pollen baskets. This nectar enables the pollen to actually ferment slightly in the hive, and that activates yeast development and it value adds the pollen. But nectar is really it's a sugary, watery substance as a nectar, but when the bees dehydrate it, they concentrate all of the sugars and all of the goodness of the vitamins and minerals to enhance the food resources that they are collecting and storing. Dehydrated honey, down to 18% moisture content, will store for a very long period of time, and they found honey in the pharaoh's tombs that was still consumable. Solitary bees don't have a community to help them to dehydrate or to value add their foods. So what the native bees do is they will dehydrate the nectar on the go. This is a bee and she's collected enough nectar to fill her crop. Now what she does is she regurgitates that nectar and she'll pull it in and out of her nectar crop through her mandibles and her tongue. Here we have, this is her tongue, and she's holding the droplet of nectar between her mandibles. She'll work that nectar droplet until it's concentrated enough that she feels that she can then continue to forage and add to that, and then she'll dehydrate it more, and then she'll continue to forage and dehydrate it more until she gets a nectar crop that is filled with more concentrated nutrients and energy for her offspring. She'll then take that back to her nest and she will have a very nutritious food resource for her babies. Solitary bees collect dry pollen. Here we have a blue-banded bee. She's got pollen on her tibial scopa. And here we have a resin bee. She doesn't have a yellow belly. This is a resin bee who's filled her scopal hairs with yellow pollen. She will take that back to her nest, and then she will unpack that pollen and she'll regurgitate the dehydrated nectar, and then she will knead that into nutritious dough and she will provision her nest with that. Here we have the nest of a solitary bee. She's made this bee bread by unpacking the pollen and regurgitating the nectar and then kneading that, and then lays an egg on top. And then eventually the egg hatches and this small grub eats this whole pollen package, and she then continues to develop until she's ready to pupate. Honeybees, solitary bees and social native bees require somewhere to nest where they are protected from the weather and also from predators. Honeybees form colonies in large natural cavities. These are called wild living bees, or if you don't really like them very much, they're called feral bees. Unmanaged bees can be a problem. But managed bees are kept in hives and they are looked after by the beekeeper, and the beekeeper ensures that they are managed and don't swarm unnecessarily. Beekeepers will harvest honey that is contained in comb, which the bees produce from wax that their bodies will secrete. The beekeepers will put in frames in the hive, and this is where the bees will store and dehydrate the nectar into honey, but they'll also rear their brood, which is their babies. So nectar is dehydrated down to 18%, and that's what we call ripe honey, and ripe honey will not ferment. About 30% of our native bees will nest in pre-existing cavities. Here we have a resin bee nesting in a man-made nest, and you can make bee hotels, but in nature, these bees will nest in old borer holes, in rotting wood, between cracks and crevices under bark, and any little refuge that they can find. But this can be mimicked by our building of bee hotels. So what we're doing by providing them a nesting space, whether it be areas on your farm that are already there and you just maintain those areas, don't burn all of the fallen wood. If you're concerned about stock or machinery, you can pile it up into a pile and keep it away from the stock and machinery. And that is then a sanctuary for the bees and other insects and reptiles to hide and nest, and then they can increase their populations within a local area. Here we have a male carpenter bee, saying peekaboo. He's nesting in his favourite space, which is a grass tree spike. So not only do we provide native plants for food resources, but they're also potential nesting spaces as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see some pupae that are inside a grass tree spike. 70% of our bees nest in the ground. They'll dig a burrow, and the burrow may be as shallow as 2 centimetres, or it could be as deep as 3/4 of a metre. This little burrow here is about 3/4 of a metre deep, and it was dug by a 10mm long bee. And these are all the brood cells that she's made, and this is where she rears her babies. It's important to keep these ground nesting bees in mind when we're gardening or performing property management tactics. Some of these bees are only about 5mm long, some are up to 17mm long, but either way, they're very small little bees. And it's quite difficult for them to dig through heavily mulched areas of the garden. So it's a really good idea just to leave some spaces, about at least 1 metre square, without mulch or with very little mulch, in order for these bees to be able to access the soil and dig their nests. Of the 2,000 species of native bee in Australia, only about 11 species are highly social, and these are our stingless bees. This bee here is a Tetragonula carbonaria. She's stingless, she's mostly black, and she's only about 4mm long, which means that she can access a lot of very small flowers as well as large flowers. There's 2 genera of stingless bee in Australia, that's Ostroplebia and Tetragonula. They nest in larger cavities than solitary bees, but not as larger cavities as honeybees. They'll nest in hollows in trees, but they can also be managed in hives, similar to honeybees. Stingless bees don't use frames as honeybee keepers will be able to manage their honeybees with frames. Stingless bees just make these pots. So this is pot honey and pot pollen, and they're much harder to harvest the honey. It can be quite traumatic for the bees, but properly managed hives can have supers on top, just like honeybees. These bees naturally occur as far south as Bega, but then they move up the coast, the east coast, and once the populations that naturally occur get to about Kempsey, they start to then spread west along the top of Australia. So mostly they are warmer climate, at least subtropical and then tropical and arid areas. So unfortunately, those of us who live on the west of the Great Dividing Range or south of Bega, unfortunately we can't keep stingless bees because they just don't have enough warm hours in the day and warm days in the year to collect enough food to store. So if we tried to keep them, they wouldn't survive.
Thanks, Megan. And now back to Anna.
So as part of using the Powerful Pollinators Guide, it's great to understand a bit more about bee-friendly practices and principles and how systems and resources interact in the environment and how you can build upon them in the best way possible to provide basics for bees and other insect pollinators. The starting checklist, if you like, includes providing flowers and habitat, that's a place to live, extending flowering times so that you have literally a smorgasbord of forage across the calendar year. And so you're looking at extending flowering times as often as possible across different species. Providing clean water and a safe water supply for bees and other insects to visit that is separate to water sources that you may need for your house or garden. And if visitation from pollinators causes disruption, it's great to provide a separate water supply. And having an impact on the environment that is as minimal as possible in terms of application of chemical and chemical load in that habitat. So I'll introduce to you some examples of those as we talk through the next few slides, and just give you some more foundation into understanding bee-friendly practices and principles. So in an agricultural and food production context, and this is often across large swathes of local landscapes, when we look at crops and native vegetation and supporting pollinators in these environments, it's important to consider what that landscape looks like. And here in Australia, in the main, some of our crops that require pollinator visitations are grown across large tracts of land in a monocultural setting, so one crop species at a time. And this may be on single farms, or on a particular farm you may have a mix of grazing and cropping systems. Sometimes you might see shelter belts adjacent to paddocks that are planted out with native species or introduced hedging species for shelter and shade for livestock. But these plantings also provide a starting point to build pollinator habitat in those environments, and particularly where it's adjacent to cropping systems where pollinators can be of excellent service. And unless we have these diverse environments either adjacent to or amongst these cropping or grazing areas, then the ability of pollinators to contribute to those systems is limited. So ideally, and you can see this from looking at this slide, there are all sorts of different species types and structures and diversities adjacent to and amongst these cropping systems that you can see here. So there's two distinct crops in the picture on the right, a grain and a broadleaf crop. In the background, there are some trees planted for shade and shelter, some of which are native species. But key to what you can see in this image is the proliferation of various species of wildflowers and herbs that give space and refuge for native pollinators when the crops may or may not be either growing or have been harvested or absent from those systems. So in amongst these areas of wildflowers and diverse habitat, there's places to nest, to take refuge, to feed and to breed. And the photograph on the left shows a bee on a brassica crop, such as a mustard or a canola. And in these species, honeybees particularly are key to enhancing pollination and therefore seed set and yield. So it's all about creating diverse and maximising niches, habitats and places of refuge for pollinators in agricultural systems. And this certainly applies at a smaller scale in urban and city environments as well. In terms of practices that support pollinators, it's useful to think of a hierarchy of considerations that's sometimes called integrated management techniques or integrated pest management, IPM, and think about the actions that you may take in trying to control pests that may be either beneficial to or damaging to pollinators. So the hierarchy of principles and decision making relates to avoiding if it's at all possible, the use of conventional pesticides. And you can see that at the top of the triangle in the diagram. It's best to start with proactive practices, which may be creating enhanced habitats for beneficial bugs and pollinators, practicing various methods of cultivation and weed or pest control that is not chemical based, and also using natural controls such as organically certified products and other biocontrol agents in preference to chemical controls, particularly because a number of chemicals in the insecticide, fungicide and herbicide categories have been demonstrated to be detrimental to beneficial pollinators. And so with those principles in mind, it's time to talk about using the guide and putting some steps in place, understanding those principles and getting into creating your own oasis, whether it's on the farm or in the garden, for pollinators to be the best they can be in your environment. And key to that is a number of understandings that I will introduce you to. First of all, it's about learning about your landscape. There are also benefits to learning and discovering more about your local flora and what grows best and naturally in your area. And then having a think about a calendar year or the steps you'll need to take in order to start sourcing plants and preparing a site or a selection of your garden for planting. And in doing so, bringing back to those practices that support pollinators and staying away from the spray as much as you can to create that beautiful oasis for pollinators. So in learning about your landscape, it's basically saying that all things are connected and that we have species of flora and fauna and areas that are connected or separated in the landscape, and patches of habitat that may be high or low in quality and extensive or restricted in quantity. And all those things come together to make up your local landscape, whether it's single trees scattered across a paddock or hundreds of hectares of wet, cool, temperate rainforest, or little strips of remnant grassland and wildflower herb fields along a roadside. It's all part of your local landscape and the flora that make it up and the fauna that live in that native vegetation. So understanding what vegetation types grow in your region is really interesting and really informative in helping you learn what will grow best in your area. And it could be to do with the climate, geology, all sorts of things that define your district or your suburb or your local government area. And that then allows you to see what kind of vegetation grows there. So it could be, as in the image in the upper left of the slide, multi-stemmed eucalypts, characteristic of the Mallee region in, say, northwest Victoria across into southeast South Australia. It could be cool temperate rainforest with big tall eucalypts and mossy paths and tree ferns that you see in the lower left-hand image. And that's very characteristic of a lot of parts of far southern Australia, such as in the Otways or in parts of Western Tasmania. Or it could be sort of an open heathy woodland and characterised by more shrubby, woody plants, including these very elegant and dramatic austral grass trees. So there's all sorts of things that come together in terms of vegetation to characterise your region. And with a good understanding of your native flora, you can also come to learn about the native fauna, specifically the insect populations that call your part of the world home. And there are amazing guides online and books that you can seek out to become a citizen scientist and undertake identification of various bugs and beetles, butterflies, flies, wasps and bees that live in your part of the world, or that are possibly living in your part of the world but haven't been seen for some time, and there's an opportunity to attract them back into your area. And these little winged insects and little creepy crawlies and little critters do best when they can access as much of the local environment as possible. And here's where we talk about patches and connectivity. It's all about joining the dots and making it a happy place for your pollinators to live. And by making different areas as accessible as possible, you're creating great habitat. And it might be that some species of pollinator love little strips of vegetation that they can flit in and out of that has lots of edges, so they can access grassland or cropland adjacent and fly back in to these small patches. Or they might like large blocks of vegetation that provides an excellent refuge and protection from predators. And understanding different species' needs is a great way to better design plantings and creating connectivity in your area. And that will then give you the difference between a good habitat and a great habitat for pollinators. To learn to understand your landscape from a quality and quantity point of view, and to put your bee goggles on, so to speak, and see the landscape with a bug's eye view. And a classic way to illustrate this concept is to look at these two pictures here. And the one on the right is quite visually stunning and very engaging and appealing to a human being. And the one on the left, you look at it and you think, oh, it's quite majestic, but it's a bit scruffy and a bit untidy looking, and you sort of literally can't see the wood for the trees. And from a human point of view, we're probably less attracted to that. But in terms of habitation by insects and other native fauna, the environment on the left presents an amazing habitat. It's got a range of vegetation, species types, from ground covers to shrubs to trees. It's got great connectivity and it's not weedy. And from a pollinator point of view, that's great habitat. So sometimes we have to be considerate of not just looking for a nice view, but looking for a good habitat as well. And then when we can connect great habitat together, we not only have quality, but we have quantity in the landscape. And that's awesome, which allows you to create an amazing oasis for pollinators. You will be able to, in using the guide and understanding the principles that we've introduced here today, bring a beautiful rainbow of nectar and pollen forage into your environment that caters for a range of species, allows them to feed and breed and nest and rest in that environment, and do so without the threatening processes of management techniques that may have a negative impact on their survival and their thriving in the landscape. So I very excitedly and enthusiastically invite you to bring back the buzz. Visit the Ween Bee Foundation website and download a free copy of the Powerful Pollinators Guide so that you can be part of bringing back the buzz. And here's a snapshot of what's inside the guide. You can see an amazing front cover that shows a native bee representative of the different regions for which we've produced Powerful Pollinators guides so far. There are fold-out panels that include how to identify and know your different pollinators, and an amazing species list inside that gives you information about all sorts of locally appropriate native plants from which to select to create your oasis. Everything from the tallest trees to the prettiest wildflowers and the tiniest ground covers, things that flower at different times of the year, whether you're looking for winter colour or a bit of summer sensation, and flowers that are anything from whites and creams through to vibrant purples and hot reds. It's all there. And then on the right hand side of the fold out panel, we have the kinds of sites that those species grow best in. Is it a dry patch of soil in full sun, or something that's quite wet and shady? And the different insect pollinators that are likely to visit those particular species of plants, so that if you need to, you can hone in on species to attract certain pollinator species that might need help in your region. So get on board and bring back the buzz. And you can use these guides to help you pick out the right flowers that flower at the right time. And alongside that, clean water for your little bee friends and your insect allies, and some insect hotels or growing and developing vegetation that provides permanent nesting habitat and breeding places for these amazing insects.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and if you'd like to have a planting guide developed for your bioregion, please get in contact by giving us a call or sending us an email.
Our next presenter is Dr. Tobias Smith, an Australian native bee expert. He's going to talk to us about the wonders of Australian native bees.
Hi everyone, I'm Tobias Smith. I'm from the University of Queensland. I'm speaking to you from Queensland. Actually, I'm speaking to you from my home, which is on the country of the Yugambeh language group, which is the Gold Coast and areas around the Gold Coast. I'm on the southern Gold Coast. So today I'm going to talk to you about native bees. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of native bee diversity in general, and then I'm going to move into one particularly fascinating group, the native stingless bees, which have great relevance for us as beekeepers because they're the native bees that you can keep and manage in hives, much like you would with European honeybees, although there's some important differences as well as some similarities. I'll get to those. First though, bee diversity, global bee diversity. So we know that there are at least 20,500 different bee species in the world. Now, these are the ones that have been discovered and described by science, And this number is constantly going up, and we think that there's probably 25, maybe even 30,000 bee species on the planet. And you can see from some of the appearances of these bees on the screen that there is amazing diversity in appearances, in lifestyles, in levels of sociality, and all sorts of things in the bees of the world. There are lifetimes getting to know the bees of the world. Here in Australia, though, we have at least 1,660. So these are, again, the number of species that have been formally described by science and given names. But this number is also going up because people are discovering new bee species still in Australia. And we think probably that there's about 2,000, maybe something like 2,500 bee species for a maximum in Australia. So many still to be discovered. And again, look at that diversity of appearances, and we've got that diversity of lifestyles as well. Now, I mentioned before this diversity in levels of sociality. So I'm sure that most of you bee lovers already know this, but you've got those really highly social bees like European honeybees that live in big complex colonies having a queen. And then you've got solitary bees, bees that live all by themselves, don't live with other bees, don't help other bees. They live by themselves, they make their own nests, they raise their own babies independently. Now, these are two ends of a scale of sociality, in fact. The truly solitary bees at one end and the highly eusocial bees at the other. But there are elements of semi-sociality within the world of bees that you find with different species. And as I go through a few individual bee species here in Australia, I'm going to get that scale across to you with some examples. So let's start at the bottom with a truly solitary bee, a blue-banded bee. Now, I'm sure probably everyone, I hope everyone who's listening has come across blue-banded bees before. There's a number of different species in this Amygdala group that we call blue-banded bees. There are also others which look like this but don't have blue bands, other banded bees. But you'll find these blue-banded bees all around Australia. Now, as truly solitary bees, these are females in the picture. Females have 4 blue stripes, males have 5 blue stripes. They nest by themselves underground. So they actually dig a short tunnel, which might be something like 10 to 15 centimeters deep. And down the bottom, they excavate a series of brood cells. So little hollows where they will raise their babies individually. And you can see from this picture, 5 brood cells that have been excavated by the photographer, showing 5 provisions of food, so pollen and nectar mixed in that ball. That's the orange stuff. And then on the bottom left there, you can see an egg that's been laid. And then in the others, you can see various sized larvae. The eggs have hatched and the larvae are then consuming that food. Now, this is not a blue-banded bee's nest, but it's one very similar to blue-banded bees. A blue-banded bee mother will do all this by herself, provision these cells, and then die of exhaustion before these offspring become adults. And in her life, which might only be a few weeks, she might provision maybe something like 20, 25, maybe even 30 offspring during that time. And that's it. She's not there to see the next generation thrive and do it all again. There's no overlap of generations. So this is a truly solitary bee. And most bees in the world, like this, nest underground. 70% of the world's bees. And 75% of the world's bees are truly solitary, like this. So that's the bottom end of this scale of sociality, really common group of bees. A little step up the scale of sociality, getting towards those highly eusocial bees, we've got communal bees. Now, these emerald homolictus, these are about 4 millimeters long, beautiful little bees, also nest underground. But what makes them different to the truly solitary bees is that you'll get multiple related females sharing a nest together. Now, they're not like European honeybees or stingless bees. They're not all helping each other. There's not a queen. They're not storing honey. They're individuals sharing the same nest, but doing their own thing. So I like to think of these as the flatmate bees. They're flatmates, females, sisters sometimes, nesting together and all doing their own thing, but just sharing the front door, the tunnel up and out of the ground. And sometimes you'll get them in one tunnel by itself, but sometimes these bees will nest in the same area. We call this an aggregation. So lots of bees with individual nests nesting near each other because the soil's appropriate, or over the years, the daughters from nests decide to nest nearby, and you get this dense aggregation sometimes, which is amazing to see. It's this hive of activity, but they're either solitary bees or communal bees. They're not all there collaborating. Let's go one more step up the scale of sociality to semi-social behaviour. And a nice example of semi-social bees in Australia are the carpenter bees. So these are our biggest bees. These are Xylocopa coptortisoma, the great carpenter bees. The females are yellow and black, hairy. The male, that golden green one there, that's a male. Now these bees, they're not nesting underground, so sort of unusual for one of the bees of the world. They, as the name suggests, carpenter bees, they chew holes in wood, in dead wood. So these bees need dead branches and things in trees. They make a little hole that you might be able to stick your thumb in, that kind of diameter, and then she hollows it out, the mother, and she raises her babies in there, just a few, maybe 6 to 8 babies at a time. And you might think, well, this sounds like a solitary bee. She's doing this all by herself. But what makes this bee a semi-social bee, not a truly solitary bee, is that these females can live for a long time. And she'll be there still as an adult, alive, when her offspring go through all those stages of growing and become adults themselves. So you get this overlap of generations, adult mothers and adult children knowing each other and in the nest persisting together at the same time. This is a form of semi-sociality. But they're a lot like solitary bees. It's still a very small scale when we compare it to the highly eusocial bees, which we're getting to. For those of you in New South Wales and down around the Hunter region and in Sydney, anyone down that way as well, you will be fairly commonly delighted if you're out in some natural environments to see some green carpenter bees. So these are slightly smaller than the great carpenter bees. They're also nesting in wood, they're chewing holes in wood. Often different types of wood. Sometimes you'll see these bees in grass tree flowering stalk stems. So when the flowering stalk was dried off, they'll chew into the pithy center. Sometimes Banksias and things like that as well. Now, these bees are worthy of a mention because these two species are actually thought to be extinct in mainland South Australia and in Victoria, where they were once found. So we don't know a great deal about the conservation status of Australian bees because not enough data has been collected over time to look for declines. But for these big charismatic bees, we do know, and they've been lost for them from those areas. So those of you who see these bees should consider yourself very lucky. And I've seen plenty of them in the Hunter Valley. So get out there and look. All right, highly eusocial bees, the bees that we're all here to talk about, really, the ones we can keep in boxes. So highly eusocial, just like European honeybees, they've got castes, so queens, workers, the daughters of the queen, the drones, the males. They cooperatively care for the offspring, so they're collaboratively working in these perennial colonies. They're going on and on and on. It's often obviously a turnover of bees within that colony, but as a single reproductive unit, it's perennial and ongoing. Now, globally, these are the only two groups, the honeybees, of which there's about 10 species, and the stingless bees, of which there are hundreds of species. I'll get to that soon. You probably have heard the term apiculture and apiarist, someone who keeps apis bees, honeybees, Apis mellifera. Us stingless beekeepers are not called apiarists, we're called meloponists because we keep bees of the Meloponini tribe of bees, the stingless bees. So keeping them, a place where you keep them is a meloponary. The practice is meloponiculture. So different terms. I'm not an apiarist. I once was, but I'm not anymore. I'm a keeper of Meloponini bees. Diversity. So there's about 600 stingless bee species in the world. So here it's just a few from Australia and from South America. The middle one obviously is Apis mellifera, a European honeybee, just for size context. So these are all relative to one another in scale. You can see the biggest one, top left there, Melopona, bigger than a honeybee. These are from South America, big, impressive stingless bees. Make a lot more honey than ours here make. Below that, you can see one of the smallest in the world, just a couple of millimeters long, Lura trigona. And then below that, the next three along the bottom there, those are some of our Australian stingless bees. So the world of stingless bees is very, very cool. Now, some similarities and some differences. They're both highly eusocial groups, the honeybees and the stingless bees. You'll be familiar with this hexagonal comb made of wax, used by honeybees to store both their food, then their honey and their pollen and their brood. You can see in the picture below there with the queen, she's walking on brood comb. This is very different to what we see inside a stingless bee nest. When we look inside a stingless bee nest, it looks like this. In the middle, we've got the brood cells. So these are very small balls. Each of those has a developing bee inside it. And different to the honeybees, which have the same sorts of cells to store their food and their brood, stingless bees have different structures. So around the sides there, those bigger balls you can see, those are the food storage pots, the honey pots and the pollen pots, and then all of that connective tissue that they make, connective structures that they use to hold it all together. Now, another difference here is this is all dark in color. It's not light, it's not that waxy color that you see in honeybees. That's because stingless bees don't use pure wax for all of this. They use propolis. So they go out and they gather resins from trees, tree sap, they bring it home, they mix it with beeswax, which they make like honeybees. That's propolis, everything gets built out of that. And that's got important factors that influence things like the flavor of the honey, but we'll get to that later. Let's have a closer look at the honey pots. So here's one that's still under construction. You can see a bee poking her head out of it. These are about the size of little grapes. You can see the rest around there are capped and closed. Little sweet, delicious grapes of honey. Here's another look at that brood. So each of the brood cells, so differently to European honeybees, which leave their brood cells open while the egg is there and then it hatches into the larvae, and they progressively feed that larvae as it grows, leaving the cell uncapped. Stingless bees cap their brood from day one. They put all of the food into that cell that that baby bee will need to grow. Then the queen lays an egg on top, then they close it. It stays closed for the entire development. So we don't have this progressive provisioning that we see in European honeybees. We have mass provisioning. And in fact, European honeybees are pretty weird in the world of bees because there's very few bees in the world that progressively provision. Most bees, I'd like to say something like 97 or 98% of the world's bees, approximately, mass provision like this. The baby gets all the food it needs from day one. Here's the queen. So like European honeybees, there's only a single queen in our Australian stingless bees. She is much bigger than the others because she's full of ovaries that are growing eggs, and she'll lay for the main group of stingless bees that we've got here in Australia, the tetragonula bees, about 300 to 400 eggs per day. This is actually not a tetragonula queen, but that doesn't matter. They look very similar. This is the other group, Ostroplegia, that we have. But a queen, we think, will live between about 1 and 4 years, and then she will need to be replaced. She'll die of natural causes, or she'll die of attack from another colony, or she'll die of attack from her daughters if she's not doing a good enough job. All of that's another story. So they need new queens, and those start as virgin queens, princesses, like European honeybees. But again, the difference, because of the way that they grow young bees with these mass provision cells, it's a bit different to honeybees. So you can see right in the center of the picture there, that much bigger brood cell, that's got a developing virgin queen, a princess inside it. So the only difference between a worker female and a princess female is the amount of food that she's fed as a larvae. It's not different food, it's the same food, but in a much bigger brood cell like that, she gets fed much more and she grows bigger, and her ovaries don't degenerate as they do in the worker bees. So she has the capacity to become a queen and to lay eggs. Worker stingless bees don't lay eggs in these ones, the main ones, tetragonula, that we have here in Australia. Now, when she comes out, she looks like this. Here's a princess, a lot like a queen, but not as big. She's quite a fast walker. Now, the process of going from a princess to a queen like this is a whole story in itself. It's dramatic and interesting. So a queen can live between 1 and 4 years, remember. Princesses, on average, no one's actually measured this, but it seems that they probably produce something like 1 per week on average as a backup. But if a queen lives between 1 and 4 years, they don't need all of those backups, 50-something backups a year, probably. So what happens to those? Well, they seem to get tolerated for a little while, and then at some point in their development, after a few weeks, if they're not needed, they get the chop. The bees surround them, hold them with their mandibles and pull them apart, or resin them up, or do something else that's nasty to kill them. Some of them might sneak out and try and go and requeen queenless colonies elsewhere, but that's not something that's very well understood either. So basically, being a princess is not very good unless you're the lucky one that happened to be there at the right time. And if you are, you need to mate with a male bee, unlike European honeybees who can mate with multiple male bees, the queen. a stingless bee queen will only mate with one single male, which she'll do outside the nest. The boys will be out there waiting for her. She'll mate with one. She'll come back inside. Her abdomen will swell with egg production like this, and she'll never leave the nest again. She becomes an egg-laying slave to the workers for the rest of her days. Okay, let's move on. Here in Australia, we've got the two groups I mentioned. We've got the tetragonula stingless bees and the Austroplebia bees, and you can see that they've got these different ranges. Tetragonula are the ones that you tend to find closer to the coast, and for those of you in Newcastle, tetragonula are all you've got. You've got Tetragonula carbonaria, and then further south of you, if you go a little bit north of Newcastle, you'll start to see Austroplebia, one species of Austroplebia, Austroplebia australis. Up here on the Gold Coast, we've got 3 native stingless bee species, and we see another one as we go up to Brisbane. These two groups, the bees look remarkably similar to one another until you get intimately familiar with them. But when you look inside the nest, their brood, the babies, looks different. And you can see this really nice layered pattern to the tetragonula brood there, whereas the Austroplebia don't have such a layered, they have what we call cluster brood. So the brood cells kind of all on each other in a spherical ball, not these distinct layers. So a very obvious thing once you see inside the nest. Now, most people who keep these bees in boxes keep tetragonula. Austroplebia is kept, and in certain areas it's kept a lot, but on the most part, it's tetragonula. Remember, meliponiculture, the keeping of stingless bees. On the left here, a nice little box somebody's keeping in an urban garden with tetragonula bees, and on the right, some stingless bees being kept on a macadamia farm. I'll talk about pollination soon. These bees, the keeping of stingless bees is growing enormously. It's mostly driven by people who want to keep these bees as pets, but we're starting to see a lot of growth in this area of crop pollination as well, and people starting to keep them for interest in gathering the healthy honey that these bees produced, and some people with eyes to one day be selling this honey. We'll talk about the honey. How do most people propagate these bees? Well, it's usually you get boxes that are designed in such a way that they can be physically divided. The box on the right here is full with a nest. You get another empty box, and when the box is full and certain things are right, there's lots of rules about it, but when it's all right, you can literally chop it in half. You're getting brood, you're getting bees, you're getting food, and you're coupling each half with a new empty box, and you're left with 2. Much like European honey beekeepers will do as well, with frames, taking them out, brood frames and things. But with this, we don't take the contents out, we take the box itself so that we don't do as much damage to the inner contents. There are other ways to propagate these bees, but this is, for the most part, the way that it's usually done. And then you've got 2 hives, and the next year you've got 4, and the next year you've got 8, and it goes on, and before you know it, you're obsessed and you've got too many hives. We, like European honey beekeepers, have to think about how we position our bees, because bees are central place foragers. So they always come back to a place where they live and they orientate to the landscape. So if you've got a beehive that sits in one spot and you move it to a different spot that's close by, the bees will recognize the landscape, do their thing and fly back to the old spot. So we have to consider those things, just like honey beekeepers. We have to consider something else too, that our bees have a propensity to fight with one another. So we can't just go and lump 7 beehives together like this who don't know each other and think everything will be fine, because they'll fight with each other. We get to situations like this in the picture by starting with 1, 12 months later splitting it and having 2, leaving them side by side, the next year splitting again. And because these colonies are always together, they've got this constant familiarity, they don't fight, they get used to each other. They stay used to each other. Now, fighting can happen as a beekeeper making a mistake of putting 2 hives that don't know each other together, or it can happen naturally, because these bees, one of the ways that they start new colonies is by exploring the landscape and either finding an empty nest site, a hollow tree somewhere, and spending a long time, about 6 months, to slowly establish a new nest, differently to European honeybees. The alternative is, instead of looking for an empty nest site, just go and find a full nest site, find another colony of stingless bees that you think's weaker than yourself, and kill them all and move in. And most stingless beekeepers will see this eventually. It's very dramatic. You get this big swarm of bees outside a hive, lots of bees falling to the ground in pairs and dying. So attackers attacking, defenders coming out, catching each other in the air, falling to the ground, killing one another. And the winner is the colony that has the most bees to sacrifice. And if that's the attackers, the rest of them move in, kill the queen, kill all the adult bees, take it over, bring in their own princess, enslave the baby bees, and there you go. In a few days, you've got this whole colony that's got food, it's got bees, slave workers, it's got everything you need. You don't have to have this long process of establishing a new nest. Very cool stuff, but we need to move on to crop pollination. These are the crops that we know stingless bees can pollinate. So those with the green smiley faces, macadamia, blueberry and avocado in particular, stingless bees are effective pollinators of these crops, and growers of these crops use stingless bees as managed pollinators. The others there too are less commonly used by stingless bees, are less commonly managed in these crops, but interest in stingless bees is growing, and I'm sure that they're going to be following, and this is going to be becoming more of a common thing in these crops and other crops as well, no doubt. Honey. So stingless bees gather nectar, just like honeybees do. They concentrate that nectar into honey. And you can see on the left, this bee with this big full abdomen swollen of nectar flying home, and on the right, a bee that's not flying home with nectar, so you can see how much they can hold inside. They do the same thing as honeybees. They repeatedly regurgitate and evaporate off water, turn it into honey. And we know a bit about stingless bee honey. We know that it's very different to honeybee honey. It's more watery. It's got these strong flavors. It's got this sharpness to it. It's got this citrusy tang. And very recently, work from the University of Queensland has shown that it's also got something else that's very special. This sugar called trihellulose. So you've got your glucoses, your fructoses, your sucroses. Trihellulose is another one of those sugars. And the dominant sugar in Australian tetragonulus stingless bee honey is trihellulose. Now, that's exciting because trihellulose is low GI. Trihellulose, the bacteria that causes tooth decay, doesn't grow in trihellulose. So it is genuinely this healthy honey. And we're beginning to understand more and more about this with ongoing work at the University of Queensland. And I think watch this space, because you've heard of Manuka. One day you'll be reading all about stingless bee honey and the health benefits that it has too. Something else about stingless bee honey, apart from having trihellulose in it, is these other qualities that you get from the way that it's stored. Honeybees storing their honey in these wax cells. Wax has no flavor. Wax has no chemistry really that infuses into the honey. So you're just getting the taste of the nectars in honeybee honey. In stingless bee honey, they're storing that honey in these propolis pots, wax and tree resins. Those tree resins infuse flavor. So you get this very typical tang, this bite, this tartness to it when you eat a stingless bee honey that comes from that. They also infuse chemicals, antimicrobial chemicals. And we think that some of the other health benefits that probably come from stingless bee honey, such as potentially antimicrobial qualities. These sorts of tests have been done in the lab looking at antimicrobial qualities, and this honey is very good. And we think probably some of that comes from these chemicals infusing from the resin. So again, watch this space. There's so much that we still need to learn about stingless bee honey. You can't really buy it in shops yet, but you will be able to one day, and it's going to be remarkable when it happens. I'm done. That was a crash course on native bees. I'm going to finish by saying that at the moment, those of you in Newcastle and the Hunter are not travelling. I'm very sorry. I hope you're all going well with your lockdowns, tolerating your lockdowns. But when travel can happen again, we offer native bee workshops at the University of Queensland. In particular, those worth travelling for are the identification courses that we run. They're on this year, you can't come, but next year, maybe you'll be able to come, they'll be happening again. So watch this space if you're interested in bee identification in general and the skills you need to know to do that. Thanks very much. Enjoy the day of online talks. See ya.
I hope you enjoyed the next presentation from Dr. Nirul Chocterton. She's a research fellow for the I3 Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's got a wonderful presentation on Australian honey, a prebiotic food.
Hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Naral and I'm a research scientist based at the University of Technology, Sydney. I'm a microbiologist and I'm really interested in understanding how bacteria cause infections and finding new ways to treat or prevent these infections, and that's how I ended up researching medicinal honey. My research focuses on two main areas. The first is looking at the antibacterial activity of honey and how we can use it directly to treat infections, for example, for wounds or skin infections. The second is looking at whether eating honey has any therapeutic benefits, specifically whether honey can act as a prebiotic food that promotes good gut health, and my talk today will be mainly focused on this area. So we know that honey was used very effectively as a medicine throughout history, and it still remains in use today, although not as much as we'd like to see. The reason that it's been so popular as a medicine is because honey can have broad spectrum antimicrobial activity, which means that it can kill bacteria and other microbes that cause infections. The most popular use of honey has been as a topical treatment, particularly for wounds and skin infections, and there have been many records of its use in this way. Just as an example, there are extensive records from ancient Egypt showing the use of honey as a wound salve, and it was used in the complex surgeries performed by the ancient Egyptians, like circumcisions, which is denoted in the graphic here. The main reason that honey fell out of favour as the preferred medicine was because we discovered and started using antibiotics in the 1940s. But today, we have a shortage of effective antibiotic treatment options for infections because we're seeing a huge increase globally in the number of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, or superbugs. And this happens because bacteria have learned to fight off the effects of our antibiotic drugs much quicker than we can discover and make new ones. Antibiotics kill bacteria or slow down their growth so much that they can no longer cause infection, and they do this by targeting certain things in bacteria, like their protective cell wall or parts of their metabolism, just like we can see in this cartoon here. But bacteria evolve and change very quickly, so this means that they can learn to fight off or resist the effects of the antibiotic drug so they no longer have an effect. This is what's known as antibiotic resistance. It's not that the drugs simply stop working, but the bacteria have changed to fight off the effect of the drug, and we call these bacteria superbugs. When bacteria become superbugs, they hold on to what gives them the ability to resist antibiotics in their DNA, because it gives them a competitive edge in order to survive. They can also swap and share this DNA with other bacteria, which means that they can give and take the ability to resist other antibiotics as well. So, what we end up with is many different types of bacteria with the ability to resist many different antibiotic drugs, and this makes treating superbug infections incredibly difficult. Probably one of the most exciting things about honey scientifically is that bacteria don't seem to develop resistance to its killing effects. Even though honey has been used for thousands of years, there have been no reported cases of honey-resistant superbugs, and we can't generate honey resistance in the lab either. What we do in the lab is treat bacteria with increasing doses of honey or antibiotic to train them to become resistant to the treatment. And in the results here, when the graph deviates above that red dotted line, it means that these bacteria are resistant, so the treatment is no longer effective. If we follow the black line, which is the antibiotic treatment, we can see resistance within just 2 weeks. At the 15-day mark, it crosses that red dotted line, the threshold. So the bacteria just become more and more resistant as the days progress, because you can see that that line increases dramatically. When we look at the blue line, which represents the honey experiment, the line never crosses that red dotted line, that resistance threshold. So no matter how long we train the bacteria to fight off the honey, they just can't do it. We've tried this with lots of different types of bacteria and honey, and the results are always the same. So one of the most common misconceptions is that all honey is the same, but honey isn't a generic or a standard product. It's very complex with over 200 components. So in the same way that different honeys can look and taste very different, they can also have very different medicinal properties. There are multiple factors that contribute to its antimicrobial activity, and all honeys will have some degree of antibacterial activity, but not all are at levels that can quickly clear infections. The first factor is that honey is high in sugar, which means that it has very little water available. And just like us, bacteria need water in order to survive. Honey also has a low pH, which creates an acidic environment, and most bacteria can't tolerate this. These two factors are similar in most honeys, but they make up only a very small amount of the total activity we see. So honeys with activity coming from just these two factors alone are unlikely to be a good substitute for topical antibiotics. The main reason for significant activity in some honeys is because of the production of hydrogen peroxide, which is like a weak bleach, and this is toxic to bacteria. This peroxide-based activity varies hugely from one honey type to another, and it's dependent on the floral source. For example, Jarrah and spotted gum honeys can have very high levels of this type of activity. Then there are some very rare honeys with high levels of activity beyond the peroxide activity, and this is also linked to floral factors. The most famous example of this type of activity is seen in Manuka honey from New Zealand or the related Manuka type honeys from Australia. Because of these antibacterial components, this is probably why we see no resistance. It's great for using honey as an antimicrobial because it means that it's unlikely that bacteria will be able to develop resistance anytime soon. There are too many factors at play here. But we know that this use is mostly limited to topical applications. So why is there a lot of evidence that honey also works internally? Is it just about stopping the growth of those nasty infection-causing bacteria, or is there another bioactivity or other bioactivities of honey that we can use therapeutically? With all of this in mind, there are lots of things that we want to learn from honey, partly driven by scientific curiosity, but also because we want honey to be a viable treatment option, and for the most appropriate honey to be used in the most appropriate way. So, we're working on questions like, what makes honey a good antimicrobial? And is this use only limited to its topical use, or can we use these antimicrobial properties systemically as well? Are there any benefits of eating honey? For example, can honey be working as a good prebiotic food? Does it affect our gut microbiome in some kind of way? What contributes to the prebiotic effect if we do have one? And can we use honey to re-engineer a compromised gut microbiome? So as an example, can we target gut-related conditions? And finally, what influences the bioactivity of honey? So whether we're looking at this prebiotic activity or the antimicrobial activity, what kind of contributions do the floral source, the geographic origin, or bee-related factors and environmental factors play in this bioactivity? Like its other medicinal uses, there is a long history of use of honey as a remedy for many digestive ailments, and there are plenty of records throughout history about this use. For example, here we have an ancient Arab script showing the making of medicine from honey, and this medicine was prescribed specifically for digestive ailments like stomach and intestinal bloating or swelling, diarrhea and cramping. But it's unlikely that the use of honey for digestive ailments is due to that antimicrobial activity, because we wouldn't expect this type of activity to survive in our digestive process. So we think that honey might be acting in a different way when we eat it, and this could be linked to the millions of bacteria living in our gut, known as our gut microbiome. We're also appreciating more and more that not all bacteria and microbes are bad. Most are actually good for us. So over the past century, there's been a shift from just trying to get rid of all bacteria and microbes to trying to nurture and harbour the right types in the right balance. When we talk about microbiomes, we're referring to communities of bacteria and other microorganisms that live in a particular habitat, and these can be found everywhere. They're in the soil, in the air, in the water, and of course on and inside of us as well. We now understand that bacteria are essential to our survival, and they perform a range of very important functions in the environment and also in our bodies. The largest population of bacteria in the human body lives in our gut, and there's a lot of research now targeted in trying to understand what it is these gut bacteria do and just how important they are to our overall health. What we do know is that these bacteria influence the normal functioning of our bodies and our nutrition and health. They can help to build our immune systems and fight off infections and disease. They help us digest our food, they make essential vitamins, and they remove toxins from our bodies. They also influence our hormones, our immune system, and even the way our brains work. And because of all of these really important roles, we're very focused on trying to create and maintain a healthy gut. And we still don't know exactly what a healthy human gut should look like yet, but what we do know is that it's important to have lots of different types of bacteria and that they should be in a balance of beneficial and even some that are normally thought of as potentially harmful types. When the balance of our gut bacteria is off, that's when we start to see things like bowel disease, including colon cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, irritable bowel disease, and also conditions outside of the gut too. Our gut bacteria seem to influence whether we get fat, suffer from allergies or heart conditions, or even mental health issues. We can also see the balance in our gut disrupted if we get a gut infection. That happens when potentially harmful bacteria, like this little red bacteria that's touching the intestinal barrier there, breach that protective barrier of our intestines and set up a camp here. So essentially, the numbers of the potentially harmful bacteria outweigh the numbers of the beneficial ones. One particularly problematic example of a gut infection, and one that we're really interested in working on, is called C. difficile infection. Now this one's caused by a particular type of bacteria called C. difficile, and it often happens after we take a course of antibiotics, because those antibiotics wipe out most of our gut bacteria, including the beneficial ones, and it allows these potentially harmful C. difficile to really quickly populate our gut. In some cases, it just presents as mild diarrhea, but it can very quickly progress to life-threatening inflammation of the bowels, and because there aren't many effective treatments for this gut infection, we're interested in understanding if we can use honey to help here. So there are a few different ways that we can manipulate the balance of our gut bacteria. Our lifestyles and hygiene habits, and whether we take antibiotics, affects this balance. And of course, our diet plays an important role too, because certain foods that we eat, called prebiotics, can also feed our gut bacteria. A prebiotic food is a complex carbohydrate or a complex sugar, like those found in many root vegetables, that we don't digest ourselves. So it reaches our lower gut or our colon, where it can be used as a food source by the many different types of bacteria living in our gut. Now, prebiotics are different to probiotics. Probiotics are living bacteria that we ingest, so these can be in the form of those supplements, the fermented milks, and even in yogurt. So what this does is deliver one big hit of good bacteria to the gut at a time, whereas prebiotics are foods that feed the bacteria we already have living inside of us. So our main research question is whether honey is a good prebiotic. We know that honey is made up mostly of simple sugars, fructose and glucose, but there are some complex sugars that we don't digest that could be driving some of this prebiotic activity in our gut. So I first started looking at this during my PhD using a gut model in the laboratory. Similar to what's happening in this cartoon, we used digestive enzymes and other compounds to treat the honey as if it were passing through the digestive tract. And then we used that digested honey to feed our gut microbes that exist in our stool. So here I looked at 20 Australian honeys from different floral sources, including eucalypt, canola and leptospermum, or those manuka type honeys. And to sum up those 4 years in one little cartoon, we found that all honeys showed prebiotic potential because they either boost the numbers of the beneficial bacteria, reduce the numbers of the harmful bacteria, or increase the production of beneficial compounds called short-chain fatty acids. These are made by our gut bacteria and they help to fight off different types of gut diseases. So the honeys all did slightly different things, or a combination of all of these things. So even though they weren't all exactly the same, they all did have some kind of prebiotic effect. We then ran a pilot clinical study with healthy volunteers, looking at whether a small daily dose of honey would show similar results to our laboratory model. So we looked at changes in the gut populations of our volunteers and the compounds that the bacteria were producing. Again, this was done from stool samples collected before and after honey consumption from our volunteers. And here in the results, the grey lines show the response of the individual participants, and the solid black lines show the overall trend before and after eating honey for a month. And what we found was that honey helped to boost the numbers of the beneficial bacteria here in the blue and the green, so the lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. And it helped to reduce the numbers of the potentially harmful bacteria, the Clostridia group here circled in the red. We also saw that honey helped our gut microbes produce more beneficial compounds, which play a protective role in the development and progression of many gut-related conditions. And it didn't seem to matter which of the honeys we used in this study. The prebiotic activity we saw was not linked to a particular floral type. In particular, it was this reduction in the potentially harmful bacteria, the Clostridial group, circled in the red, that was really exciting for us, because C. difficile infection is caused by species of bacteria from this group. So we wanted to understand if we could use honey either to prevent or treat infections in the gut. So our current project aims to tease this apart a little bit more. We're looking at a couple of New South Wales derived honeys that are produced in high volume, but don't necessarily demand those really high premium prices. And we have two main approaches. We're running a clinical study to understand exactly what changes eating honey has on our gut. We're looking at the populations of bacteria, the compounds that they produce, and also how these changes might influence our immune response. By understanding these trends better, we may be able to identify certain gut conditions that could be targeted with honey. So recruitment for this clinical study is underway, but sadly we were very much affected by the COVID-19 restrictions and we couldn't recruit participants for well over a year. So hopefully by next field day, I hope that we can discuss the results from the clinical study. We're also using gut models in the laboratory to look at whether honey can help to target certain gut infections, and I'll present some of those results now. So I had an honours student this year, Izzy, who looked at three main areas. First, we wanted to look at whether honey could reduce the numbers of the potentially harmful bacteria already living in our gut. So these bacteria live in our gut in a balance with our good bacteria, but if something happens where that balance is slightly off, they can very quickly overpopulate and start to cause infections. We also looked at whether honey could help to treat a C. difficile infection in a simulated model. So we pretended like we were infecting a normal gut with C. difficile, and this is all in the laboratory model. And finally, we looked at whether honey helps our gut microbes produce compounds that can kill potentially harmful invaders that cause infections in the gut. So rather than using honey directly to treat those pathogens that cause infections, can we use honey to feed our own gut microbes, who then indirectly will go off and produce those compounds that can kill the gut pathogens? So Izzy chose 3 honeys to test in her models this year. We had a jellybush honey that's prized for its high antibacterial activity, but very little is known about its prebiotic activity. We had a commercial honey that has low antibacterial activity and a high concentration of the complex sugars called oligosaccharides that we think are contributing to the prebiotic effect. So that one was OliK8. And finally, we have a New South Wales yellow box honey that has low antibacterial activity and from my PhD studies showed good promise as a prebiotic. We also included a positive control called inulin, which is a commercially available complex sugar, often referred to as the gold standard prebiotic. So we set up these laboratory gut models using stool samples from a healthy volunteer as the inoculum source, and this represents the diversity of the bacterial populations in our gut. We then add either the honeys or the inulin positive control, and we also have a similar setup with no honey and no inulin, and this is our negative control. We then count the change in the potentially harmful bacteria already living in the gut before and after treatment with honey. Specifically, we were looking at the populations of Salmonella and E. coli, which are the main culprits for food poisoning, and populations of C. difficile, which causes the C. difficile infection I've already talked about, and inflammation of the bowels. So here we're looking at how the numbers of Salmonella and E. coli change before and after honey treatment. The dark grey bars represent the before, the lighter greys represent after. And what we can see is that all 3 honeys were very good at reducing the numbers of these harmful bacteria, especially when we compare it to the negative control when there's no honey in that gut model setup. When we look at the change in the C. difficile populations, the results were a little bit different. 2 of the honeys seem to actually promote the growth of the C. difficile, so you can see that the after bars are actually bigger than the before bars. And this was pretty disheartening, especially compared to the positive and the negative control, where we didn't see this happen. So overall, it looks like honey can reduce the numbers of some potentially harmful bacteria in the gut, but not necessarily all. Next, we wanted to simulate a C. difficile infection. So we set up the gut models like before with the stool samples and honey, inulin or no honey, and then we added a dose of C. difficile to replicate a gut infection. We then counted the numbers of C. difficile before and after honey treatment. So like before, the darker grey bars show the number of C. difficile before the honey treatment and the lighter grey bars show after the honey treatment. And what we found was that honey did reduce the numbers of C. difficile in this infection model from before to after for each of these honeys, but it wasn't as effective as the negative control. So actually having no honey in the system, in this case, was better than having honey or inulin in the system at all. So you can see that the after bar with the no honey control dropped significantly more than when honey or inulin were in the system. So far it looks like honey might not be a suitable option to use on C. difficile directly. But from our other studies, we do know that it can have some kind of effect on this Clostridial group. So our next step was to see whether honey was helping our other gut microbes kill off pathogens. So rather than honey having a direct effect, could we feed our other gut microbes honey to make them produce compounds that could then kill pathogens like C. diff? So that's what we looked at here. We set up our gut model in the same way as before with the stool sample and honey or our positive and negative control. And after letting the bacteria feed on the honey and make their compounds, we took just those compounds of interest to see how good they were at inhibiting the pathogens of the gut. And what we found was that honey was very effective at helping our microbes produce these compounds that kill pathogens. So we tested this on Salmonella and E. coli, those food poisoning pathogens, and they weren't able to grow at all. So when we use these compounds that were produced by our gut bacteria feeding on honey, these pathogens couldn't grow at all. And you can see that when we compare it to the no honey bar, the one at the end, our negative control, that bar is really big, which represents really high growth. So compared to that, our honeys and our inulin control were very effective. We also saw a similar trend with the C. diff when honey was used in the system. Our gut bacteria were able to produce these compounds that stopped or slowed down the growth of C. difficile compared to when there was no honey in the system at all. So it looks like even though honey might not have a direct killing effect on C. difficile in the gut, we can still manage the numbers of C. difficile by using honey to feed our other gut microbes, which can then produce these compounds that inhibit the growth of C. difficile. So to sum up, we think that honey can be an effective prebiotic, and it can do this by reducing the numbers of potentially harmful bacteria already living in the gut. It can also reduce the numbers of bacteria that cause food poisoning and also the harmful C. difficile, but we need to do a little bit more work here to understand if it works better as a preventative approach or a treatment, especially for the C. diff infection model. And finally, when our gut bacteria are in the presence of honey, they themselves can produce compounds that kill invading harmful bacteria. And this could prevent an infection from occurring, and that means we don't have to have the honey working directly on pathogens in the gut. And overall, the work that we do in the bioactive honey space really highlights the different therapeutic properties of honey and how they can be exploited in different ways to target different conditions or issues. So some might be best suited as prebiotics to boost gut health in healthy people, others might be used as a prebiotic tool to treat certain gut infections, and others still might be best for their antimicrobial activity topically or their anti-inflammatory activity. So what are we working on next? Well, we're just starting a new project under the New South Wales Government Bushfire Recovery Scheme, where we'll do some more work in the bioactive honey space to add value to Australian honey. Specifically, we want to focus again on the prebiotic and antimicrobial activity of honey, but this time we want to see how these are affected by a variety of different factors. So things like floral source, for example, when bees are feeding on a mostly monofloral crop versus a diverse diet. What do the bees contribute to the bioactivity of the honey? So we'll be looking at the hive health, the age of the queen, whether the bees or the hive has been fed supplements, and also how do the stresses on bees affect that bioactivity of honey? And for stresses, we'll be looking at things like environmental stresses, whether that's climate, bushfires, drought. We'll be looking at chemical stresses like pesticides or insecticides or the use of antibiotics, or stresses of pollination as well and how that affects the bioactivity of honey. So I'll just finish off by thanking the many researchers that have contributed to all the bioactive honey projects. Of course, our funding bodies, AgriFutures, the Honeybee and Pollination Program, has funded most of the work that I've presented today. And our new grant under the New South Wales Government Bushfire Industry Recovery Package will be funding the new project that we're doing. The biggest thanks to the Australian and particularly the New South Wales beekeepers, because not only would we not be able to do this work without you, but our research really wouldn't mean as much if we couldn't help to support this crucial industry in some kind of small way. And thanks to everyone who's attending today. If there are any questions, I'd love to hear from you, so please reach out at any time. Thanks.
Our next talk is from Dr. Cooper Shooten, Project Manager, Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods from Southern Cross University. His wonderful talk is on the 5 pillars of beekeeping in PNG.
Hi everyone, my name's Cooper Shooten and I'm a beekeeper and beekeeping researcher at Southern Cross University in Northern New South Wales, and I'm also the project leader for Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods research group. So I work with an amazing team of researchers here in Australia that work in the honeybee industry, but also some amazing people who work in the bee industries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific region. At the moment, I have programs up and running in Fiji and Papua New Guinea that are funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which I'm going to talk about, and some of the photos come from today for this presentation. So big shout out and thanks to all those who invited me to present at this excellent event, and all the sponsors for this Tocal Beekeepers virtual field day. I wish I could be with you all in person doing some beekeeping and catching up afterwards, but hopefully it won't be too long before we'll be able to do that again. So today I'm going to be talking about the 5 pillars for sustainable beekeeping development, which is a bit of it's a conceptual framework. So it's these core pillars and considerations of what to consider when you're implementing a beekeeping program overseas, but it's also something that we can apply to our beekeeping operations here in Australia. I'm going to be talking about why beekeeping is one of the most mutualistic forms of agriculture, in my opinion, and also some of the benefits that beekeeping has to offer for these rural communities and what actually needs to be considered to make them successful. So benefits of beekeeping. As we all know, bees produce honey and that can be sold for money, but there's a whole range of other benefits that beekeeping has to offer in terms of a livelihood or income strategy for some of these rural communities overseas and also here in Australia. So bees, their role in pollination obviously is critical. So not only of natural forest areas, but also for agricultural crops. And you could imagine if you're a subsistence farmer having a significant increase in your crop production and the quality of that fruit set as well, that's going to have a major impact on your life. Bees also produce other products such as beeswax and propolis, and you can value add to these to produce lots of other amazing products, so lip balm and candles and soaps and surfboard wax and surf zinc and all sorts of different products. To service the beekeeping industry, you need a whole range of different things too, such as bee boxes and frames and veils and gloves and smokers and nucleus colonies and queen bees. So these all represent viable income opportunities. So they're businesses that people can start up overseas, not just about managing the bees themselves, if that makes sense. It's something that's accessible to marginalised groups. It doesn't require the ownership of land, and it can be conducted on land that's pretty marginal. So in regions where you've got really steep slopes or the soil's not very fertile for cropping, you can run pretty amazing beekeeping operations. Beekeeping can be a lot of fun. I've put down the bottom there, so I'm sure you all know bees can be a lot of fun, but I think it's pretty important to consider that because, often in life we're usually going to be successful at the things that we actually enjoy doing. For beekeeping overseas, there's a lot of different associations and clubs, and even like what we're doing today for this presentation series, it's about getting together and working with other people and sharing our passions. People can also have opportunities overseas and even here in Australia to travel for beekeeping work, particularly under the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme for some of the communities overseas, to be able to support our beekeeping industries here in terms of skilled labour. Beekeeping doesn't take up a lot of space, so if you don't own much land, that's pretty good. And like I say, it can be conducted in marginalised areas. Because it's not competitive for space, it also means that beekeeping can help to reduce pressures to clear land. And so, in combination with having to have a good understanding of the floral resources within the operational range of a beekeeper in order to be, successful in producing a good crop of honey, this can be a real incentive to protected forest areas if these beekeepers have, a good understanding of that these forest areas are generating an income for them. It also enhances communications, unlike other types of cropping systems. So it means beekeepers have to communicate with some of their neighbours and talk about how some pesticides are actually impacting on their bees and that sort of thing. It's something that doesn't take a lot of time, and some beekeepers that are listening now are probably like, yeah, right. But in comparison to lots of other types of farming systems, beekeeping can actually take quite a little amount of time in comparison, and returns on time can be really important. It's something that beekeeping, in terms of a honey product, can be used for cash income, but also as a barter and trade commodity, and can represent an important sort of cash savings within the household. And a really interesting one is that honey doesn't perish. And so what our research is showing is that in many of these regions where people don't have access to financial services such as a bank and loan schemes and things like that, they're using their beehives as a form of savings, or their honey money. Their hives are like a form of a bank, and they'll be lining up at the front to pay their school fees at the same time. We're the places that are purchasing honey. There's the same lineup, so people are coming down with all their honey to sell it so they can get their cash and pay for some of their fees, and that's really important in terms of income smoothing. You could imagine if you just had all your cash in your pocket or on your table, it's at home, it's probably not that safe, but also you probably spend it pretty fast too. Lots of different health benefits for honey, and that can be really important in areas where you don't have access to good health care. And so I guess another one I just wanted to point out too, obviously there's lots of these, but honeybees have amazing capacity for climate change adaptation. We find honeybees to be productive and prolific all around the world in highly diverse climates, and therefore finding ways to support and integrate them into typical agricultural farming practices is pretty valuable economic and scientific and social pursuit. So as we can see, the value of honeybees and beekeeping in lots of these developing countries and here in Australia is worth more than just honey, that's for sure. So how to implement sustainable beekeeping? So, lots of people are getting excited about bees. There's obviously lots of significant positive outcomes of beekeeping, but in many cases around the world, we're seeing lots of programs starting up. People are getting bees, but they're not always successful. Their colonies don't always survive. I've asked hundreds of people who've worked in development practice in low and middle income countries overseas, all these programs that are implemented, and the results are showing that if you give, perhaps 100 beekeepers a hive and some beekeeping lessons and come back in 3 years, you'll have about an 80% failure rate. So attrition amongst beekeeping adopters is a chronic problem. Colony losses are high. Support for and coordination of the sector is generally pretty low. And people's practices and their production and income from beekeeping as a result is pretty inefficient at times. So today I'm going to be talking about these 5 pillars of beekeeping. They are education, extension, honeybee nutrition, pests and diseases, genetics and technology. And they are, in my opinion, in order of importance. But I'm going to start at number 5 and work my way down to number 1, because technology is the one that people always seem to bring up first, but in some cases it can be almost the least important. So technology. The key function of a bee box is to house some bees, and given the range of success stories of managing bees in various size hives, we can only sort of surmise that this choice of what sort of sized hives to keep, or the type of hive, is more about the beekeeper's preference and what they have access to, rather than how productive it is in that region potentially. So factors such as nutrition and flora, the age and genetics of the queen, pest and disease management, these are overriding issues which determine the productivity of the colony, not the shape, the size, material or colour of the bee box. So often people come to me and say, well, we should have this type of hive overseas, but often one of the best things to do is to use, local people are usually using what works best for them already. So it can be really good to try to use local bees and local inputs. And part of the reason for that is that it can sustain their operations long term if they actually have access to it. Another thing to consider here is that defining what beekeeping success looks like for different groups is different. We might see this beekeeping operation here in number 2. This is beekeeping in Indonesia with a small Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. We could see that as being pretty, pretty low productivity. You can't check the combs. It's pretty damaging to the bees if you want to get the honey out. But nevertheless, that coconut trunk hive there probably cost about 1 cent, if anything. And it takes the beekeeper not that much time to make it. You can make it out of local materials. And yes, the honey production is pretty low, maybe only 5 kilos from that colony in a year. But nevertheless, they can just have 100 of them because it doesn't cost them much money. So there's lots of different benefits and opportunities, but also different pros and cons, I guess, to different beekeeping equipment. Number 1 there is honey hunting with a giant Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata. That bee it's not a cavity nesting species, so you can't put that bee in a box. And you've got top bar hive beekeeping there. It seems to work for some groups overseas, and also Langstroth beekeeping with Apis mellifera down the bottom there in Java. So, using Apis mellifera and there's sorts of beekeeping systems can be very productive, but they also cost a lot of money to run. So a key thing here is to try to use local bees and local inputs, and remember that productivity is not always profitability. Some systems that are pretty low input actually can be pretty profitable in the long run. Genetics and bee breeding. The key thing here is to try to keep these bee breeding programs pretty simple for a lot of these communities. I mean, bees can be bred for lots of different things, as we know: increased productivity, their colour, their pest and disease tolerance, temperament, ease of handling, hygienic behaviour, reduced swarming tendencies, whole range of different things. I mean, I'm still trying to teach my bees how to make me a coffee in the morning, but still working on it. I'm sure Liz Frost will get this sorted for us one day. The demand for these queen bees overseas, and even here in Australia, often exceeds supply. So it's something to consider in these programs. So it's not just overseas, it's also about just increasing the supply of these queen bees. Believe it or not, aggressive bees are not that fun to work with, and this can be a real impediment to people learning beekeeping, because all they're thinking about is getting stung rather than the actual biology of the bees and working out what's going on in these frames. Often local bees can be pretty well adapted to local conditions, and importing queen bees can pose many risks and can often fail. Nevertheless, it can also be a pretty amazing opportunity for some of these areas that haven't had improved genetic stock. Often a hybrid probably will prevail. In some of the projects we're working on at the moment with some queen bees from Australia with Dr. Rob Manning, WA, getting some queen bees over to Fiji and PNG, obviously going through very strict biosecurity protocols first. But I mean, our bees here haven't had their selective pressures for varroa. So when these queen bees turn up, they may be very productive and easy to work with, but perhaps a hybrid may perform better because it hasn't necessarily had that exposure to varroa, for example. One thing to consider when I'm working in some of these programs is that I often hear about bee breeding, but what is often observed is just simply multiplying queen bees from some of their better stock with no real good record keeping over time. So the key thing here with some of these programs is to keep the program simple, focus on those core characteristics that are going to be really important to them. Don't get too carried away trying to incorporate too many things. Just about temperament and honey yields and good record keeping over time. So often for evaluation, this should be undertaken at least twice annually, because within bee colonies, the quality and the performance of any colony is going to vary seasonally because of the conditions that they're exposed to. So that's bee breeding and genetics in some of these programs overseas. Pests and diseases and biosecurity. So the key thing is to be able to identify, monitor and manage pests and diseases. And that includes pests and diseases that we already have in countries and the ones that we don't, because some of our best biosecurity on the front line is you. It's you as a beekeeper. It's our people that are out there opening hives on a daily basis and looking in their hive and going, gee whiz, I don't know what that is. I better report that because that could be something exotic. So that's part of our strength in our pest surveillance systems. There's more than 40 known pests and diseases of honeybees globally. Obviously we live in a global climate now. We've got so much trade that we've got movement of different bee products and bees around the world, and so that means we're increasingly susceptible to different pest and disease risks. In any location, the information regarding pest and disease distribution, their impacts and their management it changes so rapidly, both throughout time and space where we move around the place. So some of these pests and diseases can be very difficult and almost impossible to identify without different equipment. And it's really important that the correct species be identified in order to implement appropriate monitoring and management programs. So we might think that varroa is all just one type of mite, but it actually is not. There's lots of different variations to a theme, and even different mites in different places can have very different impacts on bees depending on their virus loading and all sorts of things like that. So key things here are to be able to understand the seasonality of these different pests and diseases, be able to identify diseases and the cause of this, different pathogens and their modes of transmission and infection. Understanding the difference between an infectious and a non-infectious disease is pretty important. Appropriate identification and monitoring techniques. So this can be really critical. And understanding what appropriate management response strategies are. That's because, if we're going to be using chemicals to control some of these pest diseases, for example, there's lots of different trade-offs that come into play here, such as, the cost of it, whether people can actually afford it, how that impacts on the profitability of their whole enterprise, how effective those treatments are going to be at killing those pests and diseases, whether that can have any impacts on the honey quality or other bee products. There can be issues of tolerance or resistance build up amongst some of those pest and disease populations where you go to use that management option and it doesn't even work anymore. Also the education extension around how to use it properly and not hurt yourself and actually hurt yourself in the process or your bees, and also access to some of these things. So there's some of the key considerations regarding pests and diseases, being able to effectively identify, monitor and manage them. Right, so the fourth pillar is honeybee nutrition. Believe it or not, bees can't just eat big McDonald's burgers all day long and be healthy. They need a diversity of floral resources coming into their hive in order for them to meet their nutritional requirements. So I've written up here, the key thing to remember is that no trees, no bees, no honey, no money. Nectar is the primary carbohydrate source that's converted into honey in the hive. You can substitute this. The beekeepers can provide bees with sugar syrup when in times of need. And pollen is the primary protein source. So this has got the amino acids, fats, lipids, vitamins and minerals. So most other issues can be rectified to some extent. So some pest and disease challenges can be overcome if we have good nutrition. So just when you're healthy, you can overcome and fight different pathogens and diseases. So nutrition is really critical here. The value of nectar and pollen production amongst flowering plants varies significantly in their quality, their quantity, and also their seasonal availability. So it's really critical that beekeepers have a good understanding of what's in flower within their operational range so that they can make informed management decisions about when to harvest honey, when to treat for different pests and diseases and that sort of thing, get ready for swarming and make up boxes. And another concept that's really important is the value and potential use of supplementary feeding, and really having a purpose and a goal in mind when we're supplementary feeding, not just feeding for the sake of it, but what are you really trying to achieve by doing that, and how are you measuring the outcomes of doing that in terms of how much honey production you're getting and income. So some of the things we do with beekeepers overseas, we work on developing floral calendars, field diaries, keeping records of when nectar and pollen's coming in, and doing pollen analysis and pollen trapping to look at some of the key primary pollen sources that are in some of these regions. You can see that there's a real diversity of pollens coming in. That photo on the left there is from the highlands of Papua New Guinea. It's like almost like a rainbow. There's so many different flowers up in those regions. And also, supporting education and training extension on best practice supplementary feeding. So that's honeybee nutrition. Remember, no trees, no bees, no honey, no money. And the last pillar is education extension. I've actually divided this up into 3 different slides. So it's looking at education, training extension, but also quality assurance and marketing and good governance. So risk, inclusivity and vulnerability. And this is one of the most important pillars because without there's a prevailing social and economic and political environmental conditions that they're really important determinants within the overall enabling environment of a beekeeping operation or industry. And while some of these technical pillars for beekeeping are so critical to a successful operation, unless we can take this information and transfer it in a way that beekeepers can understand and actually implement that into their operations, then it's pretty hard for this to actually have the outcomes that we are looking for in terms of their productivity and their profits and their resilience of that beekeeping operation. So some of the sweet tips I've got on this slide is to think about the beneficiaries and ensure that there's ongoing mentorship throughout different changing seasons. So some of the research I've done overseas is showing that a really important predictor of beekeepers' success and their income from beekeeping is actually that they didn't start just for the money. They started because they were actually interested and passionate about bees. And I think that speaks volumes for those successful beekeepers. Another thing is that a lot of successful beekeepers can identify a mentor. Not just someone that came in and did some quick training. They had an ongoing relationship with someone who could show them how to manage bees throughout different changing seasonal conditions. So that's something else that's really critical. So training, education, extension. It's the core sweet tip here is to ensure that we're conducting outcome-based and practical training. So it's no good that people go to training days and they just get a certificate at the end and they can't actually demonstrate they have any skills. They need to be able to demonstrate and you've got to hand over the hive tool and let people actually do things for themselves to be able to actually learn it. And it's often that we have, very passionate beekeepers teaching beekeeping, but they don't give the participants a chance to actually have a go and have a dig themselves. That's something that's really critical in this training we work with overseas, is that it's outcome based. They have to be able to demonstrate they have the skill and that it's practically orientated. So not just sitting in a classroom talking about theory. There's so much theory around beekeeping that's really important, but not all of that theory is critical to just being able to keep your bees alive and harvest a crop of honey and keep pests and diseases at bay. So focus on those core skills, how to light a bee smoke or identify a queen bee, etc. There's some really core skills there, and ensure that it's outcome based and practically orientated. Something else that we do overseas that's been a lot of fun and has also had a lot of impact is getting our beekeeping trainers together to give peer-to-peer feedback on their training approaches. What do they do in a classroom? And then getting them up to present on a theoretical concept and then on a practical concept as well out in the field. And they give peer-to-peer feedback. What they did well and how they can improve, and they share ideas and tips and tricks and that sort of thing. So that's been something that's been really great in the education extension space. So ensure that training is outcome based and is practically orientated. Quality assurance and marketing. So obviously we need to have a market in mind. Often local markets are usually the most suitable for achieving some of the highest prices, not always, and often, people want to consume local bee products, and the quality needs to reflect that market demand, obviously. It can be really important to draw up participatory guarantee systems in some of these regions that we're working to basically improve the communication. So it's not just a supply chain. We're thinking about a value chain here. So strengthening honey value chain linkages. And that's the relationship that people have between the input suppliers, the producers of the product, the people who buy that and process it and package it and transport that product, the retailers, and then the final consumers. So it's actually thinking about, what do the consumers want first before we produce this product, so we can actually try to deliver that to them so that they're willing to pay for that product. So trying to enhance some of those relationships between these different actors along that honey value chain can be really critical. And the last one is looking at risk. So this is good governance. We need to be actively inclusive and conscious of vulnerability to ensure that all people benefit from beekeeping operations. Something we've had success with is the family farms team approach in PNG and other areas to ensure that we're creating programs that are empowering women's groups and youth and war veterans through different mechanisms other than just participation. So it's about going beyond just being involved. It's about improving their agency, so people's skills and what skills they'd like to learn and that sort of thing, and then what they aspire to do with their beekeeping operations, or their aspirations, and looking at those relationships that they have within the industry. So with other beekeepers, with extension agents, with government organisations, with associations and NGOs. And these relationships can either enable them or actually make things more challenging for them. And also thinking about the political and governance structures that are there to ensure that different groups are not just included, but they're actively involved and have meaningful roles, and they have a voice and working effectively within the beekeeping industries. So it's also important to be conscious of different shocks, trends and seasonality within any beekeeping operation or industry. So there's a photo here of an operation in PNG. We're doing some experiments and there'd been an earthquake. There were some really cranky bees there, but thinking about how earthquakes or cyclones or drought and fires can impact on your operation in the industry is really important. I mean, we can't just assume these things are never going to happen. And if we think about it now, how we can actually respond to these shocks or trends and that sort of thing, we can be better prepared to actually respond to them in a way that's going to not have such a big impact. So the key thing here is to be actively inclusive and conscious of vulnerability. So they're the sweet tips. Try to use local bees and local inputs. Remember, productivity is not necessarily profitability. Keep bee breeding programs simple and focus on those core characteristics that are of value to the industries that are there. Try to identify, monitor, manage pest and disease pressures and bee biosecurity. Remember about bee nutrition, it's so critical. No trees, no bees, no honey, no money. Think about who's involved in some of these programs, so the beneficiary selection process, and ensure that these people have ongoing mentorship throughout different changing seasons and climates. Ensure that training is outcome-based and has practical orientation, focusing on those core skills that are going to enable beekeepers to produce more honey. And we need to be able to try to strengthen honey value chain linkages and be actively inclusive and conscious of vulnerability. So they're the 5 pillars for beekeeping for development: education, extension, honeybee nutrition, pests and diseases, genetics and technologies. All right, thanks everyone for having me. Pleasure to be able to present at the Tocal Beekeepers Virtual Field Day. Thanks to the organising committee and the team at Tocal, New South Wales DPI. And yeah, thank you all for joining in. Happy to take any questions. Feel free to be in touch via email. Happy beekeeping.
Please welcome Rod Burke, New South Wales DPI Biosecurity Officer, sharing some insights and information about small hive beetle.
Hello, my name is Rod Burke, Bee Biosecurity Officer with New South Wales Department of Primary Industry. We're talking about small hive beetle, which are little beetles making the most of any opportunity to overwhelm your beehive. Small hive beetle was first noted in Australia around 20 years ago. They have since spread far and wide, both through natural dispersion, as they can fly up to 10 kilometres, and also via the movement of bee colonies between apiary sites. The distribution, mainly found in New South Wales and Queensland, but also encountered in ACT, Victoria and South Australia. They're not found in Tasmania or Northern Territory, nor most of Western Australia, and they don't want them there either. The humid coastal areas are generally where the highest numbers of hive beetle are seen, due to optimal breeding conditions and soil moisture. Crafty and looking for every opportunity. Being so opportunistic, they will exist and attempt to breed anywhere. This includes in hive debris found in the bottom or corners of hives, and trays of vented bottom boards. Adult hive beetle will harass stressed, weakened or diseased colonies and look for any opportunity to lay eggs that the bees will not be able to clean up. They often concentrate on the weakest colony in an apiary and will invade it in large numbers. The overwhelmed colony may abscond, and the hive beetle will have a party that every beetle is invited to. The larval stage of hive beetle causes the damage. They destroy everything, turning it into slime, and they do it in large numbers and can be very quick when it's warm. Small hive beetle impacts the industry because it destroys bee colonies. It contaminates honey, making it unfit for sale or use. It contaminates the bee equipment. It requires control measures, which are an added management cost, or you risk losing hives. Excessive numbers within a hive can restrict management, leading to less productive colonies. Cleaning, disposal, and replacement of contaminated equipment requires much time and financial outlay. Health issues may be caused by the yeast Codemia omeri that is carried by all stages of hive beetle and causes the slime. Many beekeepers do not use appropriate PPE when cleaning up slimed hives, and that could potentially be very harmful for you. How the beekeeper causes hive beetle to impact the hive. Stressing a hive, especially working them in overly hot, cold, wet or unfavourable conditions. Squashing bees, brood, honey or pollen by rough work, incorrect frame replacement and inadequate bee space. squashing bees when tilting or moving hives, general mismanagement of the colony and queen, example allowing swarming, not ensuring the hive returns to being queen right, not replacing an old or failing queen, not managing a weakening hive or brood diseases, not using hive beetle traps or devices when they are present in numbers, opening a hive and doing significant work in colony manipulation when hive beetle are present in numbers, allowing brood disease to weaken the hive and not dealing with them, allowing brood disease to weaken the hive and not dealing with them. I'll keep pushing that point home. It's a very important one to do with hive beetle. Abandoning or neglecting hives under their care. This causes a lot of hive beetle to be present. Heat-stressed hives are at risk from hive beetle. When the bees are away, so they're all out the front, they're not inside, the hive beetle will play. This is not a good time to be working bees when they're looking like this. Livestock. Bees often get squashed when a hive gets knocked over. Ensure you thoroughly inspect the hive once upright again and remove the squashed bees from frames. Generally the outside frames will be a mixture of honey and bees, and the hive beetle love this as a breeding point. How to reduce their impact. Keep colonies strong with a young, vigorous queen. Minimise excessive space within hives that bees cannot defend and clean up. Immediately manage weak colonies to ensure they will not be overrun. Examples being add a nuke with a young queen, or frames of young bees and about to hatch brood and get them nice and tight. Always use hive beetle traps or devices to control numbers. Remove any frames from a colony that have hive beetle pupa or slime. Immediately block up and remove any hives approaching a slime out and freeze to kill all stages of hive beetle inside. Manage brood diseases. Recovering slimed frames. This frame of mostly cat brood was in a weak colony and started to have a slime out event. You can see where it's nice new drone comb, this white area. That was full of slime. It was cut out. This frame was then put in the top of a strong colony and the bees were able to clean it all up and all the brood was able to hatch. This is slightly risky, but at times it's a good way to save frames and colonies from attack by beetles. The weak colony had a different frame put in and extra bees, and it survived. American foul brood and small hive beetle. Many people blame hive beetle for killing their hive, when in fact their hive was already dying or had died from an undiscovered AFB infection, possibly, often, because the beekeeper did not look. The hive beetle did not kill the hive, they simply took advantage of a fantastic breeding opportunity. That was a double whammy of bees robbing the diseased hive, which spread the AFB infection further, and a boom in hive beetle breeding, where they can produce up to 6,000 hive beetle per frame of brood. You need to manage your brood box regularly to ensure the colony is progressing well. Getting AFB is actually better than having a slime out. It is far easier to deal with a case of AFB than a slime out. You can recover far more equipment and usable honey from an AFB hive, especially if found early, and easily disinfect hiveware with irradiation to reuse it promptly. A slime out, on the other hand, supplies no honey, will need additional cleanup work as well as irradiation and far more of your valuable time to sort it out. You need to manage your brood box regularly to ensure the colony is progressing well. So look, if you have any questions, please get in contact. Thank you for your time today.
Our next presentation is by Melanie Parker from Happy Honey, and she's going to talk to us about her journey doing the Certificate 3 and becoming a large-scale commercial beekeeper.
Hello and welcome. I'm Melanie Parker. I have been a student at Tocal College. I've completed a Certificate 3 in beekeeping, and my husband and I run a commercial beekeeping business in Yungai Creek, which is regional New South Wales. It's a beautiful day out here in the beekeeping apiary. What I'm going to take you through in this presentation is, first of all, I'm going to share with you a little bit about my beekeeping story and what it's like for me being a commercial beekeeper. I'm also going to look at who is the best candidate for doing a Certificate 3 course in beekeeping through Tocal College and why you might wish to enrol in doing the course that I have done. I'll talk about my favourite subjects. We'll go through the total subjects that are covered throughout the Certificate 3, and I'll also discuss what kind of things I liked most about the course, what were the benefits for me. Let's also take a little bit of a look at women in beekeeping today, because one thing I've really noticed as I'm travelling around New South Wales is that there are not many women in beekeeping doing what I'm doing, and the great news is there is a huge opportunity for more ladies to join me and to be in these beautiful surroundings. Now, before we get into the presentation, I would love to take you for a look into the beehives. Does that sound good? Come on, get your bee suit on, come with me, and let's go take a look in the apiary. Are out here working on the canola fields right now. It's time to suit up. Let's go and see what the bees are doing. It's a little bit of a chilly afternoon though. Don't forget to put your protective gloves on. Here comes Shane in the Happy Honey Bee truck, bringing some extra supers for a big day of work. Now I'm going to take you inside the hive. We give the hive a light smoke, lift the lid. This is the honey super. We'll pull out a frame of honey to show you how much the bees are working it. And that's about 2/3 full at the moment. Filling up nicely. Lift the super box off. And there you'll see the queen excluder. Smoke again to keep the queen down, keep the bees calm. lift the queen excluder. We're going to pull out the second frame in from the outside gently to be careful not to hurt the queen. We can see brood, honey and pollen on this frame. Let's find a frame that's got a lot more brood for you to have a close look. There you go. Nice spring brood. Building the bees nicely. Here's a look inside a honey super with the bees actively working on the honey. A nice close-up for you. And look at this sensational frame of pollen. So many different colours. So healthy for the bees. Now let's take a more detailed look at the Certificate 3 in Beekeeping in Tocal College. Thanks for your time here with me today. Let's get started. My beekeeping story began when we had moved into a regional area of New South Wales, away from the cities, and my husband was looking for a new business opportunity. It was when we watched an episode of Landline on ABC that we saw a story about beekeepers in our local area. And we did know of some local beekeepers that lived not too far away from us. So after my husband did some volunteer work with them and learned a little bit more about the industry, that was when we began our journey in beekeeping. And we started our business called Happy Honey. We focus mainly on honey production and a little bit of pollination as well. When I first started, I was very much casual or part-time, really for about the first 2 to 3 years. I would occasionally go out into the apiaries with my husband and help just carry some queen cells or some empty supers just to be an assistant. But then after we attended the Beekeepers field day at Tocal College and my husband was giving me a little bit of a nudge to get more involved in our beekeeping business, I then did enroll for the actual Certificate 3 in beekeeping. So we were originally starting in our bees with about 200 hives, and I believe at the time that I started my Certificate 3 at Tocal, we had about 400 hives at that time. Now, about 12 months after completing the course at the time of this presentation, I'm now very much a full-time beekeeper. I was put on the fast track and we are now managing around 600 hives or a little bit more currently with my husband and I, traveling all over New South Wales and loving the business opportunity. So why would someone do the Beekeeping Certificate 3 course at Tocal College? There are 3 main reasons: to gain knowledge, accreditation, and connection. But first, if we look at who is ideal as a student in this type of course, I would definitely recommend this for larger enterprises, beekeeping, commercial businesses who are employing people. And the sooner that they can enroll and get started on this type of course, the better. This has been great for someone like me. We are running a small partnership business, and so it was a fast way for me to be able to gain knowledge and to contribute in a positive way to our business. But there are also many hobbyist beekeepers, people who have an interest in the beekeeping world, and it is a great course for people like that as well. When it comes to the knowledge gained from this course, there is an in-depth look across all essential areas of beekeeping. So it's more than just understanding how to manage a hive. It is covering many different aspects of running a beekeeping business and to be able to manage an apiary or apiaries as a whole. As far as accreditation goes, it is great to get the recognition of the knowledge and the skills. This, of course, can help someone gain employment within the beekeeping industry, anyone who is looking to get started in beekeeping. And of course, it's good for beekeepers to be able to broaden their own business opportunities. The course also provides a great opportunity for connection. It gives us a chance to meet, connect with, and learn from other beekeepers, as well as to learn from the teachers and the trainers within the course. So what did I like most about the course? I absolutely loved the combination of the theory. There was a lot of practical demonstrations and hands-on learning. So for a lot of the subjects, we were doing face-to-face learning on campus with a lecturer teaching us the information in theory. But then they would also do a demonstration within the classroom with some tools there to show us a demonstration. And then we took it to the next level where we would go out into the field, and that's where we would be going out into the apiary that was on campus with Tocal College and actually get into the beehives. And that was a perfect way of learning. There is a depth of quality and well-rounded information within the course to be able to establish people as successful beekeepers all round. I also loved the time commitment to do the course. It does work well for commercial beekeepers to be able to supplement their hours. So I found that I could still work full-time in beekeeping and manage to do the course without being overwhelmed at the same time. And I believe a big part of that is the time that is allowed to complete the course. Part of it is done on specific dates face-to-face, but then there is a lot of self-paced learning as well. So we are given a time frame to complete the course. We are encouraged to finish it as fast as we can. However, it is okay to pace it out if you need to do it. And I found that worked really well for someone that was working at the time of going through the training. So to explain a little bit more about the mix of the learning styles, first of all, there are some subjects that I did on campus learning. So these were subjects that were roughly 2 days face-to-face for each subject. And these were classroom presentations and practical in-field lessons. It was a great place to be able to meet up, get to know a lot of people, and to be able to get into the hives and learn about the bees as well. But then there's also online learning with course content that is self-paced. That again is a combination of written materials, of video demonstrations, and a lot of different modalities of learning, and it's self-paced, so you can fit it into your lifestyle where it suits you. The third thing is we were given a really great group of resource books. I found these as perfect reference tools that I can review from time to time and use as ongoing learning. So when it comes to a time when I might be starting a new season in beekeeping and I need to reflect on some of the theory for that particular task or the need in my bees at that time, I can pull out the appropriate book, find the information, and have that information come back and help me along the way. So the resource books give really great written information, but also beautiful graphics as well, and they're nicely made. Within the Certificate 3 in Beekeeping at Tocal College, there are many subjects from the basics as far as opening and reassembling a hive and learning how to use the bee smoker, to finding a bee site, transporting the bees, extracting the honey, and so many more things. There are a group of core units which everyone will go through, and then there are some elective units where we could choose some areas that we wanted to specialize in. So for me personally, my favorite subjects were learning about how to manipulate the honeybee brood. This is especially important for our business as we come into spring management. I also loved rearing queen bees because it was something that is important for us and something so new to learn. And then recognizing plants was a whole new world for me where I knew it was important information and I definitely needed help to be able to learn what type of trees and plants are best for our bees and where we can find the best resources in nectar and pollen at different times of the year for our bees. So when it came to rearing queen bees, it was a lot of new information. It was quite detailed and new information for me. It was challenging, but I loved every minute of it. And so that photo there of me is when I went back to my own apiary and put my training into practice for the first time, rearing some queen cells. And I wasn't the best at it, first of all, but we get a little bit better every time we try, and it was a whole bunch of fun. The other thing I really enjoyed and also found extremely beneficial was the subject that was about recognizing plants. And so for me, this is such a valuable tool because I came into the industry with no knowledge about what type of trees and plants are best for the bees to be able to forage for nectar and pollen. And I just loved learning how to recognize some of the trees that we are seeing as we travel all over New South Wales. When it comes to recognizing plants, I would absolutely recommend this book for every beekeeper because this has been my guide that I can go to as I'm traveling around and I see a different type of tree that's flowering, but I'm not sure what it is. I can locate it within the book and then read up about it in the resource pages. I can at a glance get a rating score and know how good it usually is for bees. I can get a snapshot of where it's roughly located within the local area, and then I can learn about how great is it for honey, how great is it for pollen. And so this book has really become one of my essentials as I'm traveling around and looking for new sites for our bees. So for us, beekeeping is not just a job, it has become a lifestyle for us. We have had many adventures traveling all over New South Wales. We mainly have had our bees on private property, so we get to meet so many farmers around the area. Inland, on the coast, lots of different great people and fun along the way. So for us, we pack up the van, we take the dogs with us, and we turn it into a traveling work lifestyle. So lots of adventures along the way. Finally, when it comes to women in beekeeping, there is a lot of room for more women to enter the industry. I have not seen many women in beekeeping as I travel around and meet the different beekeepers that are on the road. When I first began, I really thought that there's probably not much that I could do in the apiary. I thought that I wouldn't be strong enough or able to work hard enough. But I have found that from lifting honey supers to even driving the bee truck, I've learned that there really are a lot of tasks that I can do and I can contribute to the business in a way that is beneficial. So really my wish is to see a lot more female beekeepers. Don't let traditional standards hold you back. If you are a lady today watching this, whether you are younger or a little bit older, I would say that there's a role for you and encourage you to get in there and have a go. Tocal College is a way that can give us the education and the training to get there. So I say, ladies, let's dive in and break the mold with doing our Beekeeping Certificate 3 at Tocal College. So I would love to see more women in beekeeping. So now your beekeeping adventure is waiting for you. Whether you are younger or a little bit older, whether you are male or female, there are so many roles and opportunities for you within the beekeeping world. The other thing is that we do need a lot more younger people to enter the beekeeping industry as well. So I encourage the younger people here to be able to consider an opportunity to make beekeeping a career for you. My husband and I, we look back now as someone who got into the industry when we were already starting to get a little bit older, and we look back now and wish that we had started years and years ago. It's perfect for someone to begin in their 20s, in their 30s, and to be able to gain that depth of knowledge and experience along the way, because the bees always teach you something new every season, every year, almost every hive. So your beekeeping adventure is waiting for you, and thank you very much for your time today.
Our next speaker is Fiona Chambers from the Ween Bee Foundation. She's going to be talking to us about bee-friendly farming, a certification program for farmers and landholders to protect, promote and preserve pollinator habitat on their land.
My name's Mark Wooten. With my wife Eve Cantor, we farm in southwest Victoria, just north of Hamilton. We have a series of farms and we trade as jigsaw farms. And we're known for a range of things, predominantly as a grazing operation, running fine wool, lambs and a beef operation, but also for a large integrated forestry for saw logs, but also biodiverse permanent revegetation. And we're now carbon neutral by doing that as an offset program. We're very happy to be involved and become accredited in the bee-friendly farming program. And going forward, we see it as just another add-on, a very valuable add-on, which complements the other things we do. From a production point of view, the bee-friendly farming works very well within our system, and we think it enhances our system. And we think it'll do this in a number of ways. One is it will involve our biodiversity gains, which are a really big indicator for us of our health of both our farm and of the people that work here. And we think by understanding the role of pollinators, in bees in particular, we think we'll be able to enhance that. From a production point of view, I'm hoping that by having more pollinating creatures here, we'll have better plants, and not just in the agroforestry, not just in the permanent revegetation, but also in the pasture. I mean, it's a significant thing for us and for some of the small cropping that we do. We're also very happy to
Hi, that was just a bit of an introductory video to the Bee Friendly Farming Program. I'm Fiona Chambers from the Ween Bee Foundation, and I'm really thrilled to be joining the Tocal Virtual Field Days today, as I did last year. So this time last year, I was just introducing the Bee Friendly Farming Program and saying it was about to be coming. So I'm really thrilled to be today telling you about the fact that it is here and tell you all about the program and how you can get involved. So bee-friendly farming program started in America in about 2012, I think it was. And so it's been going for some time now. And a couple of years ago, when I met with the Pollinator Partnership, who own the program in the States, and negotiated with them to be able to bring the program to Australia. So Ween Bee Foundation has signed a licensing agreement with the Pollinator Partnership in America. And so we have the rights to run this program in Australia. So we launched the program just in May, so it's only been going for 5 or 6 months, and we already have over 11,000 hectares of certified land confirmed, and they cover beef, almond, avocado, grazing, just mixed fruit and enterprises, vineyards, we've got a foliage nursery. So really, really mixed, diverse set of farms that have become certified, and that's across 5 states of Australia. We expect that will double in the next month, as just with the applications we've got pending in the pipeline. So it's a really exciting time for the program. We appointed 2 technical staff just in this last month. And so we're really thrilled to be growing this program really at quite a fast rate. So who are the farmers? Here's just some of them. So you met one of them in the video at the introduction, but Ian Rathjen was one of the first farms. He runs a vineyard in Colburn in Victoria. Mike Hogan is in northern New South Wales, and his operation is a horticultural operation with custard apples and macadamias and a whole range of different tree crops. And the Bowie family in Western Australia, they've got 10 farms south of Perth, and they run beef cattle, an Angus beef cattle operation. So really, really diverse set of farms, and each of them are coming to the Bee Friendly Farming Program for different reasons. The Bee Friendly Farming Program is managed by an Australian scientific task force, and that task force has a really diverse set of skills spanning integrated pest management, bee biology, agronomy, pasture speciality, farming and ecology. And that diverse set of skills is really important to making sure that what we're doing with the Bee Friendly Farming Program is fit for the Australian conditions. Rather than just picking up what works in America, we're really making sure that the criteria are fit for the Australian conditions. The 2 people that we've just employed are Lee Hanna and Yolanda Hanush, and we're really delighted to have them on board. Both Lee and Yolanda are just in the final stages of completing their PhDs in pollination ecology. They come with a really sound set of skills, and so they're able to offer those skills to people who have become Bee Friendly Farming certified. We have a range of partners. Flow have come on board as founding partners and provided a $50,000 grant, which is the largest single grant that Flow had ever given. So we're really proud to be able to be recipients of that grant and that partnership, that sponsorship funding. One Tree Planted provided, we've partnered with to provide the tree grants that we have on offer. And we've also had the Almond Board of Australia and the National Farmers Federation come on board as well as partners. So looking forward to growing our partners for the program over time. The program has a number of benefits. So, why would you want to be involved? Well, it's really interesting that farmers and gardeners, they're coming to the program for a range of different reasons. Predominantly what the program is seeking to do is to grow pollinator flora and habitat across Australia. We know that habitat loss is one of the major drivers of one of the threats to pollinators in Australia. And so making sure that we're growing the availability of flora and habitat is really important. It also encourages the number and diversity of insect pollinators. So we're really committed to not just improving conditions for honeybees, but to make sure that we've got that diversity of other pollinators, because the science is very clear that where you've got an increased number and diversity of pollinators, you get much better pollination outcomes across the crops that you're growing. One of the other benefits is being part of a program that allows for continuous improvement and best practice. So we're really, through our technical scientific task force, through our technical advisors, we're really providing some scientific supports to really encourage best practice on farms, whether that's with planting, what you're planting, whether that's for IPM, or a range of other practices. It really is about improving making sure the conditions are as good as possible for pollinators on farms. Being part of the Bee Friendly Farming Certified program gives you access to tree grants, and I'll be talking a little bit more about those in a moment. And people that are certified are then able to apply the signs, use the signs. So you can't just buy a sign and put it up. You actually need to be part of the program to have access to these signs for farm or garden or partners. So what are the criteria? There's sort of 5 or 6 key things to be part of the program. The first one is offering floral resources to provide good nutrition on at least 3% of your land. Now, where does that 3% come from? That's actually grounded in science, where it's shown that 3% is really the sweet spot where you do get to see a change and an improvement in biodiversity. So that's why the 3% is there. What we're seeing with the applications that have been coming through is many of the farms are achieving well above the 3% minimum. But for farms where that's a bit of a struggle, what's important is their commitment to working towards increasing that floral resource availability to that minimum of 3%. And so we're working with landholders to achieve that. And the tree grants have certainly been helpful in assisting farmers with that transition. But having 3% available floral resources, but that only is not enough. You also have to make sure that that 3%, the flowering, is across the growing season. So if you're in an alpine area and you've got snow on the ground for 3 months of the year, the growing season would be 9 months. You're not required to have it for 12 months if it's too cold and insects aren't flying and feeding. So it is across the growing season. So we're really wanting people to think and plant strategically to ensure that it's not just about the crop pollination. In this photograph, we're looking at almonds, and we know that almonds, have that short window of flowering, and in the shoulder periods, it's a bit of a desert, so there's not much there for the honeybees when they arrive at the beginning or at the end of the almond pollination. So in this picture, there's a cover crop that's being grown between the trees to ensure that there's option and that there's some floral resources and some good protein resources for the bees when they arrive at the almonds. So that's the principle. We want to see flowering, bloom of different plants across the growing season. The third criteria is to provide clean water for the bees. And whilst this is in keeping with the Biosecurity Code of Practice, it's also written into the criteria for bee-friendly farming. And that's a bit interesting because we know that water is really important for honeybees that require the water for thermal control in the hives, but it's actually less important for the native bees, but it's still a requirement of the bee-friendly farming standard because of the importance for honeybees. The fourth criteria for bee-friendly farming is the need to provide permanent habitat for nesting throughout the year. So the permanent habitat, if we're talking honeybees, of course, the habitat where bees live is in hives we provide for them. But when you're talking native pollinators, many of our native pollinators will be nesting either in the ground or in twigs and brushes. And so we need to make sure that there's suitable habitat for nesting. And now that could be through shelter belts, could be through wildlife corridors, or just by, for some bees, providing bare ground and making sure that undisturbed bare ground is providing for the nesting habitat of the species. Now, the fifth criteria is around pest management. And the first thing I'd say is that the Bee Friendly Farming Program is not an organic certification program. So when it comes to the use of chemicals, we don't come in and say you can or cannot use chemical A, B, or C. What the pest management approach is, though, is we do say you must have an integrated pest management strategy and program in place. So what is required is that landholders, first of all, they monitor for pests and are able to identify pest species. So, some people will say in their applications, we actually don't have a problem with pests. So they might be out there looking, but they don't have pests. But they're observing and monitoring and are able to identify that they actually don't have a pest problem. That's still okay. If people do have pests, though, we do require that they're able to identify what those pests are and that they take active steps to monitor the pests and know what the thresholds are, at which point that they need to intercept and take action to address the pest problem. Now, when you then reach that threshold and need to take action, it doesn't mean you then just jump straight for the chemicals, but you would first of all assess and review and look at all of the other range of options that are available to you. So those first options might be through physical management or cultural controls through your practices. Or it might be using biological methods by bringing in predatory wasps or insect species that will feed on the pest species. And if all of those things don't work, then chemicals may play a role as a last resort. But where chemicals are used, it's really important that the landholder has a strategy really clearly in place to mitigate any risks to pollinators, either in the short term or the longer term. So that IPM approach is the approach that's required. And so it's an area that we'll be working more to help people understand their obligations. As part of Australian Pollinator Week this year, we have a webinar being held on integrated pest management for farms and gardens. So I'd really encourage you to come along and learn about those practices. Essentially, we recognise in the Bee Friendly Farming program that landholders need to manage their pests on farms. And the first step would be preventing infestations. So, managing the environment to minimise infestations of pests is the ideal. But if you do then have an infestation, which will happen from time to time, no matter how good your practices are, then chemicals would be the last resort. The final thing is paying a certification fee, and this certification fee enables us to for this program to be self-funding. So for Bee Friendly Farming Certified, which is about certifying the land, the certification fee depends on how big your land holding is, and for the fee, what people get is access to our technical staff to be able to provide expert advice on, perhaps what can be done, in terms of what to plant, when to plant it, how to plant, how much area to plant, and what can be done in terms of IPM. So all sorts of advice to support the landholder improve their practices for the pollinators. That's included in the annual fee. The other thing that's included is, of course, access to the tree grants, which you need to be Bee Friendly Farming certified to have access to. The Bee Friendly Farming garden category is kept at a very low annual fee of $39. We encourage people to become involved in that if you've got a garden you want to certify. The partner category ranges from the beekeeper category at $79 right up to a platinum partner at $55,000. And when the Bee Friendly Farming certified allows farmers access to use the logo on their product. So if you're an apple farmer and you produce your apples, you're Bee Friendly Farming certified, you're a paid up member, you're able to apply the Bee Friendly Farming logo onto the apples you sell from your Bee Friendly Farming certified land. With the other categories, garden, it's non-commercial, you're unable to use the logo because it's not a commercial product. So that's why there's the difference in the pricing. Beekeeper category, because I know there'll be a lot of people in the audience today who are beekeepers. The $79 membership allows you to apply this message. So if you were selling your honey at a farmer's market, for example, you're unable to use the logo on your honey, but you are able to apply the sign to say, I'm a Bee Friendly Farming partner, and we're a proud partner of the Bee Friendly Farming program. So all of that's explained in the logo use agreements. We had $100,000 worth of tree grants to give away. We've just recently reviewed 17 grants that came in, 17 applications, and we've awarded grants across 4 states of Australia, and those grants amount to $43,500. So we were undersubscribed for the tree grants, but those grants are going towards establishing 65 hectares of habitat. And so we're on bee-friendly farming farms. So we're really, really proud that we're contributing to that increase in habitat. And, you know, thanks go to our partners, both One Tree Planted and Flow, for backing these tree grants and helping us to offer them to our bee-friendly farming farms. That money is, about 50% of that money is going to almond industry, and 15% to vineyards and 35% to grazing enterprises. So again, a really nice mix of enterprises that are benefiting from the tree grants. I mentioned we've got a couple of webinars that will be running through Australian Pollinator Week. So here's the date, just so that you remember. So look, thanks for letting me share with you today about the Bee-Friendly Farming Program. And to finish, I'd just like to leave you with a few words from one of our other bee-friendly farmers.
I've been farming all my life, but when I first bought this on my uncle, I decided to put a vineyard in. It was something my great-grandfather did when he first came out from Europe, so I thought I'll have another go at it. So I started planting in 94, 95. We run 1,500 acres, and we're running about 55 hectares of vineyard in amongst that. The rest of it's just mixed farming, sheep and wheat, cereal cropping. Probably we're farming about 85% of our property. The rest is in forest or native grass. I just noticed a bit of a decline in natural beehives around here in trees, so it's been a bit of a worry. And I just figured they're an important part of the insect world. We need to look after them, try and encourage their prevalence.
So, well, why do you care about bees? Why do you care about creating an environment for bees? Bees are not involved in directly in pollination in grapevines. They're actually a commensal organism, meaning they're a good indicator. So if we have a healthy vineyard environment, if we have a healthy vineyard ecosystem, and we have bees present, then we know that the environment's working.
Well, we don't use insecticides in the vineyard, so we need as many predatory insects as we can encourage, just to keep the balance right. And we've found in the last few years, if we've got the balance right, then things look after themselves pretty well.
So we are interested in creating an ecosystem in our vineyards, deliberately creating an ecosystem that is both beneficial to bees as well as it is beneficial to the vineyard.
Success would be the necessity to never put an insecticide on, or fungicide, or just to have a completely vineyard that's alive, I guess. We just want something to be completely alive, whether it's the soil or whether it's the canopy or whether it's a mid-row. It needs to be alive and vibrant. That's what I'm looking for.
The New South Wales Department of Primary Industries Tocal College is proud to launch 2 new online courses: nationally accredited pest and disease training for honeybees and beginning in bees, both available now for enrolment on our Tocal College education website. Tocal College has published close to 100 books on all aspects of agriculture and land management. All of our publications are up-to-date, best practice, accurate and reliable references relevant to modern ag. They are easy to read with useful illustrations and photographs for practical understanding of the subject matter. Printed and electronic, Tocal's publications in beekeeping titles include Honey and Pollen Flora of Southeastern Australia, Bee Ag Skills, and our ag guidebooks, Healthy Bees, Queen Bee Breeding, Honey Harvesting and Extracting, Pollination using honeybees, and Australian Native Bees, available now from our online bookstore. Thanks for tuning in today. As a reward to all our loyal listeners, we would like to offer 10% off all publications on honeybees. Head over to the Tocal bookstore to make your purchases before the end of the weekend.